our guests as they watch our hearing. I want to remind everyone about the protocol within the committee. We enjoy having you here to watch, but no participation of any kind in any way by the audience has participated. Those who do will be removed and banned for a year. We have today to consider the nominations of the Honorable Christopher Lando to be Deputy Secretary of State, the Honorable Michael Regis to be Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, and the Honorable Matthew Whitaker to be the U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO. We have two guests, well, we actually have one guest with us here to introduce Mr. Whitaker, and that is Senator Ernst. Senator Ernst's colleague is in a hearing right now that I think he's presiding over, and so can't be with us right now. But I've promised Senator Grassley that the moment he shows up, in deference to his seniority here, we will suspend the hearing and allow him to make a few remarks. But I'll postpone my opening statement until after the introductory remarks. So with that, Senator Ernst, you're up. Welcome to our committee.
There we go. Thank you, Chairman Risch and Ranking Member Shaheen, and good morning to my distinguished colleagues. It's an honor to be here today to introduce my friend and fellow Iowan, Matt Whitaker. And I would also like to extend my greetings to his friends and family that have joined us here today. So Matt was raised outside of Des Moines, Iowa, and went on to graduate from the University of Iowa, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts, Master of Business Administration, and Juris Doctor. And I have to state as well for the committee, and this is very important, that he was a University of Iowa Hawkeye football player and did take the team to the 1991 Rose Bowl. So that's probably one of his most significant achievements. And as an Iowa State Cyclone, I try not to hold this against him. So Matt has proudly and honorably served our state and country as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Iowa, in private practice, and most recently as the former Acting Attorney General of the United States. People are often surprised to learn how Matt and I became friends. So it all began in 2013 during a heated five-way primary for United States Senate, which culminated in 2014. As we both crisscrossed Iowa, working hard to earn the nomination for Republican running for United States Senate, we would often run into each other at the same events. And literally, we could finish each other's sentences. And we knew our stump speeches so well. The joke between Matt and I was, if you can't make it to this event, I'll go ahead and give your stump speech for you. He was once a fierce opponent, but Matt became a very, very dear friend who graciously helped me win this Senate seat later that fall. Since 2014, Matt has supported me in countless ways, offering wise counsel and keen insight on the issues facing our state, our nation, and the world today. While some may just brush it off as Iowa nice, I believe this is a clear demonstration of Matt's character. He's willing to put differences aside, strengthen relationships, and put our country over politics. Colleagues, I've had the privilege to travel with many of you, to meet face-to-face with our NATO allies. Over the last few years, during those exchanges, a consistent theme has emerged: the need for American leadership, a willingness to speak hard truths and encourage our partners to step up. Matt's experience has prepared him for this aspect of the job. With decades of law enforcement experience and having served as the Acting Attorney General, Matt has successfully collaborated across many organizations and jurisdictions. He can articulate through firsthand knowledge the evolving global threats confronting our nation and NATO allies, and he's shown the courage to take on the dangers posed by terrorism, transnational criminal networks, and those seeking to do the Western world harm. Matt's steady, proven leadership will be crucial in ensuring a stronger, safer world under President Trump's peace through strength foreign policy. Colleagues, Matt Whitaker is the right person for this time and will be an excellent ambassador to NATO, and I urge you to support his nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Ernst. Certainly good praises for the candidate. I know you're busy, so we'll excuse you if you feel so inclined. Again, when Senator Grassley gets here, we will suspend the proceedings and allow him to make a few remarks for us. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to make an opening statement here, followed by Senator Shaheen. Then we'll open it up for 5 minutes of questions for each member, perhaps a second round if we have time. And as I said, in the meantime, when Senator Grassley shows up, we'll recognize him. Today, we see a generational shift occurring in American domestic and foreign policy. For years, endless debate was a substitute for action. DEI replaced common sense, and where American strength and leadership had once been respected, we were seen as weak. Last November, Americans rejected the status quo and demanded change. President Trump is an exceptional and strong.
Okay.
President Trump is an exceptional and strong but different leader, and U.S. foreign policy will reflect a new era that places the U.S. front and center. We all know transitions are never easy, and the three witnesses before us will face challenges as the U.S. blazes a new trail. They have their work cut out for them. Today, America faces threats from every corner of the world. Hostile powers like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran have formed an authoritarian axis that seeks to weaken the United States. While these countries may not be each other's traditional allies, their cooperation competes with American interests and values. The Chinese government steals American intellectual property, floods our streets with fentanyl, and exploits our free markets for its gain while aggressively undermining American security. To counter this threat, we need to work with our allies in Asia, like Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Korea, and Australia. We must push back on Chinese influence in Latin America and Africa. The State Department should re-energize its economic mission, supporting U.S. investment in partner countries to counter predatory investment from China. In the Middle East, the fall of Assad and the tremendous success of Israel's war against Hamas has turned the region on its head, and Iran's proxies network are in tatters. We face a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to eject Iran's destabilizing presence from Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. I hope the administration will build momentum to weaken Iran before even thinking about negotiations with that regime. And of course, as negotiations with Russia are ongoing, securing a peaceful and permanent resolution to the war in Ukraine is critical. Our first nominee, Mr. Lando, has been appointed to be this Deputy Secretary. He served as ambassador to Mexico and managed one of the largest embassies. He had to tackle challenges from the illegal immigration crisis and drugs flowing into our country to ensuring ag workers could still come to the United States during COVID. Mr. Lando, I look forward to hearing about your plans to protect America in these turbulent times. Our second witness, Mr. Regas, has been nominated to be Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources. Mr. Regas, you will be uniquely situated to guide the next generation of department personnel. The American people need a State Department staffed by our nation's best, all working to advance American interests and outcompete our adversaries. You have a tremendous opportunity to return the department to peak performance and create a unified workforce that rewards merit and accomplishment rather than DEI and divisive ideology. To effectively advance our national interest, I have said repeatedly that U.S. diplomats must get outside our embassies and engage with locals. In 2022, my Secure Embassy Construction Act became law, helping free our personnel to get out and do their jobs. Under the previous administration, the State Department did not fully implement this law. I hope under your leadership that this will be remedied. Finally, we have Mr. Whitaker, who has been nominated to be ambassador to NATO. Today, NATO remains more than ever relevant to the security of the United States and Europe. Unfortunately, many NATO members have taken it for granted for far too long. Our European allies left the heavy lifting to us and, by their own admission, did not pull their own weight in defense spending. In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, but Europe did nothing. After the invasion of 2022, European leaders acknowledged the threat and pledged to do more, but not all NATO allies started to make the necessary investments. Today, Europe, by itself, still lacks the capacity to field the necessary military force. U.S. taxpayers cannot continue to foot Europe's bill without dramatic investment from Europe. Europe now realizes that fact. Mr. Whitaker, as our next ambassador to NATO, you will be tasked with preserving the fidelity, commitment, and integrity of NATO and ensuring our allies rise to meet the challenges of an increasingly dangerous world. A tough job. At this year's summit in June, all NATO allies must commit to significantly higher level of defense spending in addition to increasing their production of defense material and recruiting. Most have embraced the necessity of that new reality given Russia's new aggression. Mr. Whitaker, I look forward to hearing from you and we'll work to, that you will work to ensure our allies shoulder their share of the burden and make NATO more effective. The days of endless discussion are over in U.S. foreign policy. This is where the rubber meets the road. Thank you to all of our witnesses for your willingness to serve in what will be some challenging times. Senator Shaheen, is it all right if we have Senator Grassley, our distinguished colleague from Iowa? I understand you have a few thoughts for us.
Thank you very much to all the members of this distinguished committee. I'm here to introduce a friend and a fellow Iowan. This is Matt Whitaker, and he's nominated to serve our next U.S. ambassador to NATO. And we also welcome his family here this morning. Now, in Iowa, Matt is widely known for reasons I'll give you, but he's also well known here in Washington for his service during the first Trump administration, in which he served a long period of time, but most importantly as acting Attorney General. Prior to that, while serving as Chief of Staff of the Department of Justice, Matt traveled around the globe meeting with world leaders on law enforcement matters, notably with Chinese officials to discuss fentanyl production. During the George W. Bush administration, Matt served our home state as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, and that was from the years 2004 to 2009. His years of public service in the legal and criminal justice areas demonstrate an unwavering commitment to our country and to the rule of law. Now, back home in Iowa, Matt is known for his outstanding achievements at Kinnick Stadium, home of the Iowa Hawkeyes, because on the football field, Matt cultivated a no-nonsense work ethic and commitment to teamwork that underscores our nation's motto, E pluribus unum, out of many is one. And he never lets you forget about his support for the Hawkeyes. He never forgets about his support for the University of Iowa, and it's hard for me to get him to admit there's even a University of Northern Iowa. Matt then brings that rallying cry to bear no matter where he goes, as an athlete, as a U.S. attorney, or to the very top rung of our nation's law enforcement ladder. So I'm proud to sit here shoulder to shoulder with a true friend this morning, with the distinguished alumnus of the University of Iowa, where Matt earned his undergraduate, his MBA, and his law degrees. To my colleagues on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I want to say thank you for allowing me to introduce an outstanding Iowan for this very important nomination. And I want you all to know that I extend my endorsement to this nominee to represent the United States on the world stage with our NATO allies, and he'll do it with the same enthusiasm as he speaks about Iowa football. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grassley, for those remarks. We appreciate that, and we know you have other things to do, so you're excused. And thank you for coming to our committee and giving us those thoughts. With that, Senator Shaheen for her opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Risch, and congratulations to each of our nominees. Welcome to your families and friends who are here with you today, and thank you for taking time to meet with me before today's hearing. In only 1 month, this administration has managed to send much of the United States government into chaos. And one of the most dangerous and concerning parts of this is the administration's attack on our foreign policy and national security agencies. Until last month, USAID programs were protecting us from diseases like Ebola and bird flu. They were countering the flow of illegal weapons. And they were fighting against the radicalization of young people by terror groups like ISIS in Syria, a group that, as we know, has inspired strikes here in the United States. Today, these programs have gone dark. For some, their fate remains unclear. It has left our country vulnerable. Now, I've always supported government reform. I did that as governor of New Hampshire, and I'm all for making sure that our tax dollars go to the right place. But I don't think this is what this is. This is a wrecking ball. It is unilateral disarmament, and our adversaries are thrilled. The hosts on Russian state television can't believe their luck that the U.S. is withdrawing from the world and breaking its promises. China has not wasted a moment. They're already stepping in where the United States is standing down. And in the wake of the poorly planned layoffs by DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which I have to say in quotes, CNN has reported that Russia and China are actively trying to recruit disgruntled employees. Now, I don't believe they're going to be successful because those employees are committed to the service of the United States. But I just got back from a visit to Ukraine and Poland. And when it comes to foreign aid there, the United States is completely shut down. We met with one woman who was providing services to the children of Ukrainian refugees. She said the worst part about losing assistance was that she was told that she had to take down the American flags because they didn't want anybody to think that the United States was providing assistance. We talked to another man who was providing mental health services for refugees, and he said, in Poland, we've always looked up to the United States as our dependable ally, and now we don't feel like we can trust you anymore. I'm sure Ukrainians probably feel the same way. After the shouting match in the Oval Office last week, our most important allies in Europe, in NATO, and around the world, they don't know if they can rely on the United States anymore either. The foreign aid freeze and the mass termination of awards has hit my constituents in New Hampshire as well. Shutting down USAID has meant that we have cut 100,000 American jobs. Farmers, shippers, logistics management, pharmaceutical manufacturing. Last year, American small businesses got $1 billion in contracts from USAID. None of those businesses are going to get funding this year. I heard from a small business in Concord, our capital of New Hampshire. It's a federal contractor whose work includes counterterrorism actions in North Africa. His contract was terminated. Billions of dollars in contracts are being terminated with no regard for how they impact our national security. No consultation with the Department of Defense or the intelligence community or any of our allies around the world. I would like to see more detail on how Secretary Rubio was able to individually review, which is what they said in court documents, more than 13,000 awards, as they claimed in court filings. I don't believe he reviewed 13,000 awards. Maybe our nominees can explain this. But, Mr. Chairman, the person we need to hear from is Secretary Rubio, and I hope that he will take time to come before this committee. But whether we're talking about NATO or management and resources at the State Department, to our nominees today, I would ask this. Do you believe that withdrawing from regions that need us the most, that ending our engagement in crisis zones, that taking one of our best soft power tools off the table, does that make America safer? Does it make us more prosperous? Does it make us more secure? I don't believe so, but I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Very much, Senator Shaheen. We'll now hear from our nominees. We'll welcome their families, welcome their friends here. We're anxious to hear a little bit more optimistic view than perhaps we just heard, but these are new times, calling for new times and new ways of doing business, and we are excited to look forward to how you do that. And so if you will keep your remarks, please, to just a couple of few minutes here. You can put anything you want in writing on the record. But let's open up and hear, first of all, from Mr. Lando.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen, and distinguished members of this committee. I'm honored to appear before you today as President Trump's nominee for Deputy Secretary of State. I'm grateful to the President and Secretary Rubio for their trust and confidence, and I appreciate the time that the members and staff of this committee have spent with me. If confirmed, I look forward to working closely with you. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my wife Caroline and our children Nathaniel and Julia, who are here today, for their love and support. And I'd like to acknowledge my late parents, George and Maria Landau, for introducing me to the State Department and the Foreign Service. My father was a career Foreign Service officer for almost 30 years and served as ambassador to 3 countries in South America for 13 of those years. I was born in Spain, lived in Canada, Paraguay, Chile, and Venezuela, and attended the American School of Asunción for 5 years. My parents and my upbringing abroad triggered a lifelong passion for international relations that has culminated in this nomination. I only wish that my parents could be here today, which would have been my father's 105th birthday. The experience of growing up abroad in a Foreign Service family proved invaluable when I served during the first Trump administration as ambassador to Mexico. And my experience in Mexico, in turn, taught me what the State Department does well and what it could do better. One of the department's biggest assets is a worldwide network of foreign missions and the people who staff them. And conversely, one of the department's biggest challenges is the constant need to sync those foreign missions with policymakers in Washington. My experience in Mexico highlighted how essential it is to strengthen this feedback loop. Policymakers in Washington must provide our foreign missions with clear directions and demand accountability. And in return, our foreign missions must relay relevant and useful information back to policymakers in Washington. The State Department's political leadership must be able to articulate the President's foreign policy to our embassies, foreign audiences, and the American people, and must demand and deliver concrete results. My job, if confirmed, will be to harness the State Department's formidable worldwide footprint to make our country safer, stronger, and more prosperous. I'd like to emphasize 3 major points. First, we must defend the sovereignty of the United States, our people, our borders, our Constitution, and our laws. International organizations, treaties, and alliances can all be valuable tools for advancing our own national interests, but we must never forget that they're just tools and not ends in themselves. Our duty is to the people of the United States and to the Constitution of the United States. In particular, the State Department must recognize that global mass migration is one of the key foreign policy challenges of our time and prioritize enforcement of our immigration laws. Second, we must leverage our national strength to secure better results for the American people in terms of both national and economic security. Our diplomacy is most effective when people know that we say what we mean and we mean what we say, and that we have the resources and the will to back it up. Our country's economic and military might should allow us to rack up one diplomatic victory after another and steer clear of wars and foreign interventions. Sadly, this hasn't been the case in recent decades. And third, and I think you touched on this, Mr. Chairman, we must restore commercial statecraft as a pillar of our foreign policy. Our country's founders understood the great potential of trade with foreign nations, but for a long time now, economic and commercial affairs have been relegated to second-class status at the State Department, and our nation has racked up massive trade deficits with foreign countries. We must work closely with the private sector to open new markets for American goods and services, out-hustle foreign competitors, and attract foreign investment to the United States. We also must ensure that our trade and commercial relations are fair and that other countries don't take advantage of our markets without affording us reciprocal access to theirs. These are just a few of the key areas on which I hope to work and focus if confirmed. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you here today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lando. It's great to hear somebody who's been out on the front lines and is now going to mesh that with the management at the State Department. You certainly have a background that qualifies you for that. Mr. Regas, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen, and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. It's an honor to be nominated to be Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, and I would like to thank President Trump for the opportunity to serve. I'd also like to thank my wife, Laura, my parents, John and Zoe Regas, my siblings, and other family and friends who are here with me today for their support. And I want to recognize my daughter, Mary Elizabeth, who is at her first confirmation hearing today, and my nephew, Dino, who is at his second. It's from my parents that my siblings and I were taught the importance of public service as a way to give back to this great country to which they immigrated. My father spent over 25 years as a public school teacher, and among the 7 children in our family, 5 are in public service today. I would also like to thank the members of the committee and the committee staff who took time to meet with me during this process. I look forward to working with each of you, if confirmed, to address the challenges and opportunities before the State Department today. I would also like to thank the staff of the State Department for their support during this process. The role to which I've been nominated has enormous responsibility over how the State Department is managed and how its resources are deployed. I hope to bring my over 30 years of management and leadership experience to bear on the challenges facing the department. I believe my experience in the private sector, as well as my prior service at the General Services Administration, the Office of Personnel Management, and the Office of Management and Budget, have prepared me for this role. If confirmed, I look forward to the opportunity to help President Trump, Secretary Rubio, and the dedicated career civil and foreign service officers at the State Department carry out the President's bold vision for an America First foreign policy. Our country faces a number of challenges around the world today, and if confirmed, I will work to ensure the State Department is able to meet those challenges. For my role, I believe this means making sure that we have the right people with the right skills, doing the right things in the right places. Who are the right people? The right people are our fellow citizens, members of the civil and foreign service, working around the country and around the world, supported by American contractors and locally employed staff. What are the right skills? The right skills include the knowledge our economic and political affairs officers need to understand the American economy and how we can compete and win abroad. The linguistic skills of our foreign service officers, the skills required by consular officers, passport processors, diplomatic security, and others that allow the State Department to carry out the President's foreign policy and serve American citizens and American interests. And where are the right places? The right places are wherever we need to bring America's best talent and skills to bear on the challenges we face as a nation, and wherever America's political, economic, and national security interests need to be advanced and defended. And what are the right things? Ensuring that, as Secretary Rubio said, every dollar we spend, every program we fund, and every policy we pursue must be justified with the answer to 3 simple questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? And does it make America more prosperous? Every day I will work to ensure that we are good stewards of the resources you entrust to the Department of State as we meet the high standards set by the President and the Secretary. I also want to emphasize that reducing waste, fraud, and abuse will be a key area of focus for me. I know that every dollar we spend and every program we fund comes from the labor of a tax-paying American family. Every $100 we spend could have been a gift for a family's college fund. Every $1,000 we spend could have been the car repairs a family needs for their daily commute. And every $10,000 we spend could have been a family's down payment on their first home. In each of my previous professional leadership roles, I believe I left those organizations in a better position than I found them. And I hope to make a positive and meaningful impact here in my role at the State Department. And each of the successes that I've made previously was made possible because of the dedicated men and women I've had the privilege of serving with, who have worked together as a team to achieve a shared vision of a better workplace for our organization and better service for our customers and taxpayers. It would be an honor to serve at the State Department if confirmed, and I want to thank the committee for considering my nomination, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Regas. Again, it's good to see someone come up through the ranks and know what they're taking a hold of over there at the State Department. It's a big job, no question about it. Mr. Whitaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to thank my friends Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, both senators from Iowa. As an Iowan, it's very hard. Much like picking your favorite child, picking your favorite senator is very hard with having those two superstars. And I'd like to thank my friends and family for joining me here today. Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm honored to appear before you as President Trump's nominee to serve as the United States Ambassador to NATO. I am grateful to President Trump for his confidence and to this committee for its consideration. If confirmed, I will work tirelessly to strengthen the alliance, ensure the security of the American people, and uphold our nation's role as the beacon of freedom and liberty. It has been an honor of a lifetime to have served in 2 administrations. Throughout my career, I have overseen critical issues related to national security, law enforcement, and the protection of U.S. interests, both domestically and abroad. My experience managing the Department of Justice has equipped me well to navigate the complexities of NATO. As a former college football player at the University of Iowa, I understand that for a team to be strong, for NATO to be strong and successful, every player on the field, all 32 allies, must be strong. President Trump has been clear. The United States remains committed to NATO and to the principle of peace through strength. That principle has guided NATO's founding and remains vital today as ever. During President Trump's first term, America was strong, and our strength sent a message to the rest of the world. Peace prevailed with no new conflicts. ISIS was decimated. Soleimani was brought to final justice. The groundbreaking Abraham Accords were signed, and America was safe and powerful. I stand firm with President Trump in promoting peace abroad and security and prosperity at home. Strength deters aggression, and history has taught us that when America leads, the world is safer. I believe that a robust NATO can continue to serve as a bedrock of peace and prosperity, but its vitality rests on every ally doing their fair share. By growing our economies and investing in our common defense, the free world will thrive and reach new heights of achievement. Under President Trump's leadership, NATO will be stronger and more effective than ever before. It is important to remember what George Washington said in his first annual address to Congress. To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. In the spirit of President Washington's wise counsel, we must also recognize that true leadership demands fairness, accountability, and shared sacrifice among nations. Leadership is not charity. The American people have carried the burden of global security for too long. For decades, U.S. taxpayers have funded the lion's share of NATO's defense, while too many of our allies have failed to meet even their most basic obligations. Europe can no longer ask a hardworking welder from my home state of Iowa to pay more in taxes to bolster Europe's defense, while the products he makes are subject to unfair trade practices. President Trump has been clear on this issue. NATO allies must meet their obligations. The United States will no longer subsidize nations that refuse to pay their fair share. That is why, if confirmed, I will work to advance a policy of peace through strength by ensuring that all NATO members meet a minimum defense spending level of 5%, thereby ensuring NATO is the most successful military alliance in history. This is not just an American mandate, it is a necessity for the survival of the alliance. Russia and Ukraine are at war. China is expanding its military influence. Rogue states like Iran and North Korea continue to destabilize global security, and terrorist organizations remain intent on striking the West. The threats are real, and they will not wait for bureaucratic debates or half measures. That is why our NATO allies must first commit to spending at least 5% of their GDP on defense, with no exceptions, no excuses. Prioritize modernization and interoperability, because outdated forces and strategies cannot deter modern threats. Expand their contributions to NATO, missions and readiness, and finally prepare for hybrid threats and asymmetrical warfare. I want to recognize and express my gratitude to those allies that are doing everything that is asked of them. Your contributions have not gone unnoticed. Our mission is not to just deter, but to defeat those who seek to do us harm. That means reinforcing our military capabilities and ensuring that NATO remains the premier force for stability in the region. But strength is not only in our military power, it is in our resolve, the spirit of this alliance, the spirit of America. We stand at a crossroads. We can either commit to a NATO that is strong, capable, and prepared, or we allow hesitation and inaction to embolden our adversaries. I know which path I choose. Let's remember what Reagan said at NATO's 35th anniversary. Throughout its history, the NATO alliance has been challenged by the military power and political ambitions of its adversaries. Yet in every decade, the nations of the alliance have consistently pulled together to maintain peace through their collective strength and determination. Peace is secured through strength in steadfast partnership with those willing to defend it. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thanks much, Mr. Whitaker. We're now going to do a round of questions, 5 minutes to each, allotted 5 minutes to each of the members of the committee, and I'm going to start. And I want to start, Mr. Lando, with you. And I am assuming that you agree on the importance of our alliances in Asia to push back against China, and the fact that that's going to be really important as we proceed through this 21st century with the ascendance of China. Could you give us your thoughts on that, please?
100%, Senator. Thank you for that question. And I think you've put your finger on the key geopolitical challenge of our times for our country, which is the rise, as we've all experienced over the last 30 years, of the People's Republic of China, both economically and militarily, to now be our nation's foremost strategic competitor, really all around the world. I think there was a reference in one of the statements to they're not only in their region, but they're also in Africa, in Latin America. And I think this is the biggest overall challenge to our nation's role in the world today. And I think you've also, I think, correctly identified one of the key tools that we have to counter it. We are not alone. There's particularly the folks in China's neighborhood who have at least as strong an interest in countering China's rise and working very closely with us. We have a number of organizations there. Obviously, Japan is a very close ally of ours. Korea, the Republic of Korea, the ASEAN nations. We have the Quad with India, Australia, and Japan. So I think you have correctly identified that in trying to counter China's rise, we should work with all these nations in the region. Again, some of the ASEAN nations, the Philippines, Vietnam, they're really there on the front lines. And so I think we need to work very closely. But we also need to, I think, muster our economic forces around the world and really unleash our private sector. I think for too long, honestly, and I alluded to this in my statement, the United States has not realized the importance of economics in foreign policy and commercial practices. And frankly, China has been engaged in some degree of coercive investment in certain countries. We've seen that in Sri Lanka and other parts of the world. But frankly, in other parts of the world, they're out hustling us. our private sector is not there on the ground, coordinated with the U.S. government. And if I'm confirmed, I would love to work with the private sector. When I was in Mexico, the Chinese ambassador could go to a state and he could basically promise investment because they have state-owned companies. If I were to go to a state and they would talk to me about their investment needs and their resources, I have to go to the private sector then. I can't tell them what we're going to do. And so I think it's critical to unleash the incredible and unmatched in the world American private sector to help promote our national interest in developing some of these countries, and frankly, and obviously in a way that produces results for them too.
Well said. Mr. Whitaker, you come in to take over this job at NATO in a particularly sensitive time. As I said in my opening statement, and I think you referred to also, the fact that we're going to require our European friends and allies to step up. Look, this is the most successful military alliance in the history of the world. We're proud of it. It's strong. It's stronger today than it's ever been. The media focuses on our squabbles, but doesn't point to the fact that by adding Sweden and Finland, we dramatically increased the effectiveness and the power of NATO. Having said all that, as Senator Shaheen referred to, when someone has been supplying certain things and they decide, well, they're not going to pay the whole tab anymore, or a giant share of the tab, and asking the people to step up, people push back on you. It's human nature. It happens. We're seeing that in other areas too that we've dealt with. So your job's going to be to go over there and convince them that they're going to have to step up. The good news is you're seeing what we've been preaching to them for years, and that is that they do need to step up, that they can't be requiring us, as has been pointed out, to come in and pay a bigger share than what we should pay. And look, this is this alliance is a very wealthy complex of countries and has on economies that are similar to the United States, and they should be able to step up. So could you give us your thoughts on that briefly, because I'm running out of time, but you know the challenge, I know the challenge. Yep. In short order, what are you going to do about it?
Well, thank you, Chairman. In my 1 second that's left, I'll tell you, I agree with you. I think these challenges can be reached and overcome. I have no concerns that our European allies and Canada can all do more. They now want to do more. It's pretty clear if you read what they've said over the last probably month or two. But at the end of the day, words don't matter. It is going to be actions from our allies, and I fully expect that they will do what's necessary to continue to make NATO the strongest alliance ever on the history of the planet.
Thank you. You're going to be involved in the debate in June, as you know, when they talk about the 2.5%. That was everybody's agreement, and we're still a few short that haven't made that agreement, so it's going to be even tougher as we step up. The good news is they recognize it, and they're the vast majority of them are willing to step up. With that, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with Mr. Landau and Mr. Rigas, because I heard from a USAID contractor in New Hampshire who was carrying out a project to combat tuberculosis in Myanmar that's been turned off because of the administration's stop work order on foreign aid. Now, the contractor reported to us that a shipment of drugs is now sitting in a warehouse because they can't be delivered. And the U.S. government will owe both the cost of the drugs and the storage fees, more than they would have paid without the stop work order. And meanwhile, the drugs are expiring, and the people who need them are suffering without the medication. I think this is just one of many examples that we've heard about because of the stop work order. And I think this is a senseless waste of money. I don't think it makes us, as I said in my opening statement, stronger, more prosperous, or more secure. So I would ask you, Mr. Landau, tuberculosis is a communicable disease. It travels across borders. Drug-resistant TB is a growing risk globally. So if you could answer yes or no, do you believe that cutting off our assistance to combat tuberculosis outbreaks makes America safer, stronger, and more prosperous?
Senator,
yes or no?
Just
yes
to give
or no?
You, again,
yes or no?
I think I have to give some context to the answer.
I know the context.
Well,
but I want to know, do you think this is a good position for the United States to take to stop foreign aid without any question about what the consequences will be on tuberculosis and the threat that it poses across borders, including in the United States?
Senator, I have before me Senator Rubio's waiver, which here on its face says all life-saving medicine, medical services, food, shelter, and substance assistance has been subject to a waiver to the 90-day freeze.
And I am pleased about those waivers, but the reality is the funding has not been turned back on. Nothing is happening because of those waivers. So while Secretary Rubio has told us that there are waivers, we know that of the 5,400 or so programs from USAID, that only 500 of those have been turned back on, and that the funding is not going to help address tuberculosis and other humanitarian needs that we have. And so I guess I would ask you, if confirmed, will you ensure that if humanitarian waivers have been granted, that there will be an effort to make sure that the funding follows those and that those programs that are life-saving, that make a difference to our allies and make a difference ultimately to the United States, get turned back on?
Absolutely, Senator.
Another example we heard last week is that the administration terminated programs in Syria to interdict and destroy chemical weapons. They also stopped programs, as I said in my opening statement, to provide support to the Al-Hol camp, which holds ISIS fighters and detainees from the fight against ISIS. Again, I would ask you, do you think stopping those efforts make us safer and more prosperous and stronger?
I know you are one of the most bipartisan senators on these issues, Senator, and I would certainly commit to working with you to make sure that as we identify what here is the baby and what here is the bathwater. Because as you talk about medical, some of these critical things, they're also discovering that $2 million is going to transgender clinics in Guatemala.
Listen, I think that is a red herring. I'm all for getting rid of that $2 million going to that transgender clinic. I don't think you would get any disagreement from the majority of members of Congress about that. But that is a red herring. It doesn't account for the thousands of programs, the millions of dollars, and the thousands of people who are being laid off that provide those services around the world that do make us safer and stronger and more prosperous.
And Senator, I agree with you, and I would like to, if I'm confirmed, I commit to working closely with you so that we can identify, I'd like to hear what you and your staff, the programs you identify. Obviously, it's an ongoing process now, precisely to review these programs to separate the kind that you're talking about from the kind that I just mentioned. They're both in the bucket, and you know, the goal is to actually be good stewards of taxpayer money. Thank you.
So based on that, would you agree that dismantling all of our foreign assistance toolkit is not an approach that makes sense without reviewing the programs and seeing which are effective and which are not?
What is going on right now, as I understand it, Senator, is exactly such a review. I don't think anything is being permanently dismantled. I think we're in a 90-day period now where, under the executive order, these programs are being reviewed, waivers are being granted in particular circumstances. If the waivers are not being effectuated, I'm happy to look into that and discuss that with you and your staff to make sure that if the Secretary grants a waiver, that waiver is actually going through. I understand your concerns about that. And again, I can commit to making sure that happens. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but we'll resume the conversation when I get another round.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. And I think what Senator Shaheen brings to the forefront is things that all of us in Congress have heard, and that is that there's all of these programs out there, and they're being looked at right now, and it is a daunting task. I sat with Secretary Rubio, and we looked at that list, and I mean, it's thousands of programs. And in there, we know there's stuff, just as Senator Shaheen indicated, that's absolutely critical to the national security of the United States. And there's other things in there that ought not be in there. And for years, this has really gone unchallenged. We're supposed to be oversight, but the oversight of those billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and the thousands of programs is really daunting. So you have a task in front of you. I'm sure Senator Shaheen will hold you to the commitment that you've made, that you want to find those ones that are good for America and save them. With that, Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our nominees here for your willingness to continue to serve our great nation. And also thank you to the families who make it possible for you to be able to do that. I really appreciate that. We know that none of us could be in this business if we didn't have support and love from our families. So thank you for that. On Wednesday, Xi Jinping's top advisor overseeing Taiwan affairs, Wang Huning, urged Communist China to shape, this is a quote, to shape the inevitable reunification of the motherland, end quote. The next day, a defense ministry spokesman warned Taiwan, quote, "We will come and get you sooner or later." This heightened rhetoric has been backed by increasingly aggressive actions on the part of Communist China. Last week, a Chinese crude cargo ship, I should say, severed an undersea cable that connected Taiwan to some of its outlying islands, and the crew was detained by the Taiwanese authorities. Beijing then launched an unannounced live fire exercise just 40 nautical miles off Taiwan's coastline. Ambassador Landau, Xi Jinping has instructed his military to be ready to take Taiwan by force if necessary by the year 2027. Given Communist China's increased aggression toward Taiwan, if confirmed, what actions will you take to support Taiwan's self-defense?
Thank you, Senator. And thanks for the excellent conversation that we had in your office. And I appreciate, again, your focus on China, which is our major strategic competitor throughout the world. And we have heard some very bellicose remarks like that. The President has made clear that his top priority in that part of the world is peace and stability on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, and that the United States firmly rejects any unilateral change in the status quo on either side of that, and any resolution of that dispute by force. We have had a consistent one China policy since the 1970s, as reflected in the Taiwan Relations Act, as reflected in the joint communiques and the 6 assurances. And I think the best way, I think, to deter that, and Mr. Whitaker spoke to this a moment ago in the European context, but it's equally true in East Asia, is, as George Washington said, that the best way to deter war is to be strong. And the Chinese leadership respects strength. As I discussed in my earlier colloquy with Senator Risch, it's very important for the United States to work with our allies in the area to make it clear for everybody what the terrible consequences would be for the entire world, including the United States, if China or any of the actors in that region were to take unilateral action to disrupt the status quo on either side of the Taiwan Straits unilaterally.
Yeah, Ambassador, though, what can you do, though, if confirmed, to be able to help specifically with Taiwan's self-defense?
Well, again, we have good relations with Taiwan. We work with them. I think the Taiwanese have a need to up their game in terms of their own defense spending, and that's something that's obviously on the table. And we need to work, again, with our regional allies in the area, the Quad nations. I think Secretary Rubio's first meeting was with the foreign ministers of the Quad. And I think we need to send a very clear message to China that, that they are very much imperiling world peace if they continue this kind of saber rattling and consider unilateral actions in that area.
How can the United States better respond to, or help Taiwan respond to, the escalatory military drills that Communist China is doing around Taiwan? What can we do better to try and get them to stop these drills, the gray zone activity, that sort of thing?
Well, again, Senator, I think we work with our allies in that area. We work with Japan, Korea, Australia, India, the Philippines, Vietnam. We're refurbishing our bases in the Philippines, our former bases, and I think we can work with all the countries in the region to let China know this is not just a problem you have with the United States. These are issues that really implicate your relationships with all of your neighbors and with the world. Let me just emphasize, though, the President emphasized the other day in a press conference that he wants good relations with China. We're not looking to enter into a war with China or implacable enmity with China. There is great win-win situations in terms of potential for trade as long as it's fair. And we hope that we can focus on the positive side of the relationship to increase the prosperity for our peoples instead of going down a path of further bellicosity. And so, my job, if I'm confirmed as a diplomat, will be to encourage the Chinese to move in that direction.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our nominees and your families, your willingness to serve, and I look forward to our conversation today. Mr. Whitaker, I have an aunt and uncle who live in Iowa City. I'm familiar with Hawkeye football and your record there, and I appreciate your citing Ronald Reagan and his comments at the 35th NATO summit and your understanding of teamwork. And I think you would get uniform agreement from the members of this committee that our NATO partners all need to pull their weight. Are you familiar with the Article 5 provisions of the NATO treaty?
Yes, sir.
And when's it been invoked?
Only once in the history of NATO, and that was to support the United States of America after it was attacked on September 11th.
And our then 29 NATO allies pulled their weight, deployed, served, fought alongside us, died. And I would argue that after Russia's aggressive invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, they've continued to do the same. In fact, in total, they've delivered more support for Ukraine than we have. Support for refugees, support for their economy, and military support. If you're confirmed as you head over to NATO, I was encouraged to hear you say you view it as a strong and vital alliance and you look forward to strengthening it. Would it strengthen our alliance for us to abandon Ukraine and the uniform view of our NATO allies that defending Ukraine against Russian aggression is in our collective national interest?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Senator. Obviously, the situation on the
Please
battlefield.
be brief if you could.
Yeah, the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine is brutal. It's another land war in Europe. We have to end.
Does it serve our national interest to abandon Ukraine?
Well, what's in our national interest, obviously, is a broad question. We need.
Mr. Whitaker, I have 3 minutes, not time for broad questions. I'll simply assert, if I might, that from my view, and I think this is broadly shared on this committee, pulling in the same direction is what a team does. Showing up, suiting up, getting in the fight, and pulling in the same direction is what a team with clear-eyed leadership does. And whatever that was last Friday, I hope we can get back on track in a united approach with our vital allies instead of confusing them, dividing them, having a push for greater investment, interoperability, greater lethality of NATO as a united force would be a great mission for you. I am concerned that that is not the direction that recent conversations between President Zelensky and President Trump will lead us. Mr. Landau, Mr. Regas, if I might, I'm encouraged, Mr. Landau, that you come from a foreign service family, that you've served as an ambassador, that you respect and understand the critical role that our foreign service plays. And Mr. Regas, you spoke well about the skills that they develop over many, many years. I have visited our foreign service all over the world and am deeply impressed with their skills. And I've also visited USAID missions and programs and projects all over the world. And I will tell you, I am heartsick and angry at what I view as a chaotic, poorly executed chainsaw that's been taken to what are critical NGO partners and USAID work around the world. As my colleague Senator Shaheen said, we all expected there would be reform, that there would be a thorough and disciplined look at how to tighten and focus and align USAID's development work around the world. Instead, what we've seen in recent weeks has been chaotic. Thousands have been laid off. I have met over and over with NGO leaders who are saying that the whipsaw of stop work orders, waivers, and then the failure to turn the money back on across exactly those programs that were proclaimed as critical life-saving humanitarian programs has resulted in household name NGOs, Samaritan's Purse, Catholic Relief Services, Save the Children, CARE, laying off thousands, shutting down programs all over the world. If confirmed, will you commit to sharing with us the process you used to get to where this is, whether or not these waivers have ever been respected, and to work with us to make sure we do not abandon this critical tool of U.S. foreign policy in the face of Chinese aggression around the world.
Senator, this committee plays a very important role in helping fashion the foreign policy of the United States, of which these programs are a part. And so I certainly do commit to you, as I committed to the ranking member, to discussing. I would love to hear, A, what programs you all think are the most important and that you see have the most effect on, in terms of the constituents you know and the broader effect. And second, making sure, to the point you just raised, Senator, that the implementation is done appropriately. If there's a waiver granted, to make sure that that money is actually flowing again.
I have not heard of a single example of a waiver being granted and the funding being turned back on, which is utterly unsurprising, given that all the critical staff who facilitate payments and funding transfers have been laid off, furloughed, or sidelined. So we have literally just unilaterally disarmed one of the most vital tools in that work to deliver peace through strength in the face of Chinese aggression. I'm glad that Senator Risch recognized, as we all do, that China is expanding its influence in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. And we have confused our partners, we have encouraged our adversaries, and abandoning exactly those Americans who have spent decades overseas and then leaving that space, whether it's confronting human trafficking, working against terrorists, combating pandemics, or pushing back against Russia and China and their malign influence in the world. This was a horrible owned goal that I eagerly want to work with you to try and address, because frankly, tens of billions of dollars have been cut in the name of pursuing a few million of dollars here and there that, yes, we can all agree shouldn't have been spent the way they were spent. But if thousands have been laid off, programs in dozens and dozens of countries have been shut down, and we have abandoned a key tool of our success in the Cold War that presidents from Kennedy to Reagan recognized as critical tools in our toolbox, then we have made a profound error that is going to produce weakness through chaos, not peace through strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Coons. I think you're, just as Senator Shaheen indicated, the sooner we get these guys in place, the sooner we'll be able to rectify some of these things. So with that, I'm going to move to Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Shaheen. And thank you to the nominees for appearing before us at what is undoubtedly an incredibly consequential time. I have no doubt you'll serve honorably and ably, and I'm thrilled to support your nominations. Mr. Regas, I'd like to start with you. Earlier in my career, I served in several senior roles in the government, in the national security arena, and I saw firsthand the importance of foreign assistance for our national security. Now that I'm concerned. I think we have more than a few examples of foreign aid and the bureaucracy getting ahead of itself, of supporting an ideological agenda, and that's why I supported the review of all foreign assistance. But now that the review is complete or near completion, I want to give you a chance to clarify whether we are continuing aid programs that, to paraphrase Senator Rubio, will make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. And in particular, I'm interested in foreign aid and investment as an important arrow in the quiver for combating China's Belt and Road Initiative. Through the Counter PRC Influence Fund, foreign assistance programs have helped NGOs spotlight human rights abuses by the Chinese Communist Party, provide insights into China's opaque economy, and provide partner nations with economic alternatives to China's Belt and Road. And Mr. Regas, do you expect, or are we continuing those efforts?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I look forward, if confirmed, to looking under the hood in terms of what's going on with the pause. I believe it's a 90-day pause, so I don't think it's concluded yet. But to the extent that aid is going to be flowing towards efforts to counter the PRC and counter the Belt and Road Initiative, I think from the president's statements, he's been very clear about the challenge that China faces to the United States and to its interests. I think he views China as a strategic competitor to the United States. The way he talks about them, I don't think he talks about them in terms of them being an adversary as much as they are vigorously pursuing their own interests, and that is almost always at our expense. So I think he would, I don't want to presume what actions the president will take or the secretary will take, but I don't think his past statements on China should be cause for concern in terms of programs that are being undertaken right now at USAID to counter China and the Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, I'd like to note, and while I probably disagree with Senator Coons and Shaheen about the magnitude of the abuse of spending, I do agree with the fact that from a national security perspective, there are certain foreign aid initiatives that are absolutely critical. I would suggest to you that those combating China, which I do view as an adversary, are particularly relevant, and I would want to make sure that in the future that we talk about that. I'd also like to flag for you the Development Finance Corporation and Millennium Challenge Corporation, which have much more performance-based orientation to how American assistance is provided, are role models here, and how do you expect those to be integrated into our foreign aid strategy?
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. As Secretary Rubio said, and I think it's been repeated a few times during the hearing here, that we should look at all of the programs and spending and aid that we are engaged in at the State Department through the prism of three questions. Does it make America stronger? Does it make America more prosperous? Does it make America safer? And I think having some kind of metrics applied to this spending, so we can look at not just the outputs, how many dollars are being spent, but what are the outcomes we're getting from all of these programs. And so I would welcome the opportunity to work with you and your staff on the programs at MCC and DFC, and indeed across the entire spectrum of state to make sure we're getting good outcomes.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Whitaker, good to see you. I think you and I both agree that President Trump laid out a credible path to peace with Ukraine, with an economic arrangement, an agreement to, or a hope of stopping the fighting and creating a deterrent. We also both agreed that Europe stepping up in a much more significant way was key to restoring deterrence. How's that going to happen? How do you expect that to happen? You said in your testimony that you thought there's much more of an orientation towards more investment on the part of Europeans. How do you see that playing out?
Well, obviously, if confirmed, that I'll be right in the middle of those conversations, and I appreciated the time we spent together last week. We've known each other for a long time, and it's good to see you today and last week. I think our Europeans, partners in NATO, understand the challenge. The question is, how fast can they rise to the challenge? And I'm planning on, if confirmed, going there in the first 30 days, meeting with every single ally one-on-one and finding out what their path to the 5% is, and if they can't get there, understanding why they can't get there or why they're unwilling to. And those are the conversations that, again, with the confidence of the Senate, I'll be happy to go have with all of our important allies in Europe.
Thank you, and I'll just end with the statement. I agree with Senator Coons that based on Article 5, the Europeans, NATO did step up after 9/11, but I also will note that despite decades of constant pressure from American presidents, including Democrats, NATO continues to underinvest relative to its very commitments. And so this is not open to discussion. They have failed to meet their obligations, and I hope you'll be able to convince them that it's in their interest to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Landau, I deeply appreciate your service to this country and your willingness to come before this committee. But I'll be honest with you, I find it pretty offensive that you are trying to maintain that there is some good faith review happening at USAID when the representatives of the administration in charge of cost cutting have made it clear that the goal is to destroy USAID. Do you know what percentage of USAID employees have been fired or furloughed?
Senator, I do not. I'm here as a private citizen. I'm a nominee, so I am not part of the administration at this point.
But you don't have. Do you have a ballpark guess? You're about to help lead America's diplomatic efforts. A ballpark guess as to how many USAID employees have been fired or furloughed?
Again, Senator, I've just looked at the way the president has set this forth, that he has instituted a 90-day review period.
You haven't read reports that you might be able to cite today?
Well, I have seen some reports, again, in the press, but I want to be very careful before I start acting as if I know what is going on behind the scenes, but I'm not part of the administration yet. Obviously, if I'm confirmed, you can call me before you, for oversight.
But here's the problem. So the number is 94%. 94% of USAID staff have been fired or essentially permanently furloughed. And you stated to us that you believe this is a good faith 90-day review, and yet you actually don't know how many people have been fired or furloughed. How can you come to the conclusion that this is a good faith review when you actually don't know the extent of the terminations? Wouldn't it be relevant as to the question as whether it was a good faith review if 94% of the agency had already been terminated?
Well, Senator, again, I think it's important to recognize what are the programs and how are these people that are being
But how
fired
do
or
you come to
furloughed.
the conclusion that this is a good faith review if you don't even know what's happening?
Well, again, Senator,
You can't have it both ways. You can't come to the committee and say, I know this is a good faith review, but I don't know anything that's happening because I'm not in the administration.
Well, Senator, again, I assume the government, there's a presumption of governmental regularity that exists generally in the law. I believe strongly that the president, wants to comply with the law, wants to make sure that we are doing the American taxpayers' bidding by looking carefully at these programs and making sure that we separate the baby from the bathwater.
I just don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can come here and tell us that you know that this is a good faith review, but assert that you don't have any basic information about what's happening. Mr. Regas, which branch of government has the power to decide how taxpayer money is spent? Is it the legislative branch, the executive branch, or the judicial branch?
Thank you for the question, Senator.
My understanding, I don't need an explanation.
Oh,
Which
sure.
one is it?
Well, Congress has the power of the purse. The executive has the power to make sure the laws are faithfully implemented, and the courts arbitrate disputes between those two branches.
So if Congress has authorized an agency or a department and has appropriated money with the caveat that the money shall be spent, does the administration have the obligation to spend that money in accordance with how Congress has appropriated the dollars?
Senator, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is the executive has a role in how those monies are spent. So to the extent that the
So that seems like a pretty, and I think Republicans and Democrats on this committee should care about the answer to this question. That's a pretty easy one. If Congress has authorized a function, an agency or department, and has appropriated dollars with the word shall, do you believe the executive branch can decide not to spend those dollars?
Well, I'm familiar with like mandatory entitlement programs, which has that language, and those are on autopilot.
That's not a mandatory. It's not an entitlement program. Congress has established. Let me give you an example. The National Endowment for Democracy is established by law. We appropriate every year, and we say that the dollars appropriated, in this case $315 million, shall be spent. You're going to oversee spending at the Department of State. Do you believe that the executive branch could choose not to spend dollars that are appropriated by Congress with a shall rather than a may?
I don't think so, but I'm not the ultimate arbiter of that question and how the money is spent.
You are the arbiter of that question. You're actually being nominated for the job that would decide how those dollars are spent.
If I think the question at hand here is how is the money, on what things is the money being spent, not whether it should be spent or not.
We decide how that money is spent, and you're supposed to execute it. If we say $315 million is to be spent at the National Endowment for Democracy, do you believe that you have the ability to deny that money to be spent on the functions that Congress appropriates? This is a really important question.
I don't think so, but I also think what's that?
You don't think so? So
what's
no.
that?
So you don't think so? So yes or no?
I think if that's what the law says, then that's what needs to happen.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Daines.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thanks for coming before the committee today. Mr. Whitaker, I want to start with some questions for you. We had a great meeting, and I thank you for stopping by my office We both share, I have a sweetheart from Iowa, my wife's, and also graduated the University of Iowa. So go Hawkeyes here on behalf of my sweet wife.
Thank you, sir.
So we talked a lot about NATO. You stopped by. You go back to the 2014 NATO Wales Summit Declaration. It's taken most members a decade to meet that 2% of GDP defense spending goal, and that was only after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. It's now becoming more and more apparent that 2% is not sufficient to meet security demand. Just looking at a recent chart that lists NATO allies here, at the top 10 in terms of absolute spending countries in Europe, there were 3 that didn't meet even the 2% goal. Italy, 1.5%, Canada, 1.4%. So that's the one non-European country on this chart, but it's one of the top 10 spenders. And Spain at 1.3%. I think we both agree 2% is not enough. And yet they're not even meeting that in some cases, some of the larger countries in terms of spend for defense. You've stated support for this 5% spending requirement and taking a page out of Ronald Reagan's playbook of peace through strength. What are your thoughts on additional requirements on investment spending to ensure we're going to have modern military capabilities there within NATO?
Well, thank you, Senator. I enjoyed the time together as well in your office last week. What I would say to that question is quite simply that our European allies and Canada need to do much more. In the 10 years of underspending up until the outbreak of in 2022 of the war in Ukraine, I think is really a weakness of the alliance, and I think now we're getting a lot of positive words from our NATO allies that they will spend dramatically more, that they finally understand this time. We also have some allies like Poland and some of our allies in the Baltics that have been on message and are spending much more, and so we have to make sure that we don't group everybody in one group and chastise them all, because there's many allies that are doing more, mostly because of their political location on the border of Russia. But at the same time, it's not just a matter of spending money, and we do need dramatic more spending. It is how that money is spent, making sure it goes to modernization, interoperability, to address the hybrid threats in cyber and space. We're seeing sea cables cut in the Baltic Sea. All of these issues NATO is on the forefront, and that alliance is built and should be equipped to address those threats and to be continue to be the most successful alliance ever conceived. And I will be happy to report back to you, Senator, and the committee on what I find as soon as I get over there and hear what our allies are saying, both publicly and, more importantly, privately, but most importantly, what they're actually doing.
Mr. Whitaker, thank you. I want to shift gears to Mr. Landau. As you know, Iran's the world's leading sponsor of terror. The Islamic Republic uses revenues from oil exports to fund their network of proxies, as well as their ballistic missile and the nuclear enrichment programs. Due to recent action by the Trump administration and our allies in Israel, Iran is finally on its back foot after 4 years of appeasement from the Biden administration. Well, there's been great progress made in just a short 6 weeks. We can't lose sight of the long-term goal of permanently eradicating Iran's terrorist proxy network. Ambassador Landau, how do you, if confirmed as Deputy Secretary, plan to further degrade the Iranian proxy networks and influence campaigns that are occurring in places like Gaza, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere?
Thank you for that question, Senator, and thank you again for our great meeting in your office. Just to cut to the chase there, I think the President and Secretary Rubio have articulated a policy of maximum pressure on Iran. This was a pressure that was pursued in the first Trump administration to great success. Iran was really back on its heels at that time. Unfortunately, that position was not followed in the subsequent administration, and we saw Iran get much more aggressive again. But I think you are right. This is a historic moment when Iran is back on its heels in terms of Hamas, Hezbollah, and its other allies in that area. And we got to work with our ally Israel to make sure that Iran can no longer continue to be an exporter of terror and instability throughout the Middle East. All the countries in the Middle East, I think, want to work with us to contain Iran, and that will be a critical part of this administration's foreign policy if I'm confirmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lando. Chairman, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I've been in the Senate for more than 10 years. I've never, oh no, only one other time I've not asked a question. I'm not going to ask a question. I think it's very important that all of us, because we haven't had Secretary Rubio here to talk about the evisceration of USAID, it is important for everybody to understand exactly what happened. I'm just going to lay out the facts here. First of all, it's important to understand that the so-called Department of Government Efficiency head said that they're going to feed USAID to the wood chipper. That does not sound like a good faith review. They said it was going to be a 90-day review. And then when a federal court said that they had to not violate the Foreign Assistance Act and the Appropriations Law and the Prompt Payments Act and the Empowerment Act, they came back and they eliminated 5,800 programs at aid and another 4,000 at state. Flatly illegal. Any administration is within their rights, maybe even obliged, to review and reform spending. The way to review and reform spending is in this building. Senator Graham, as the chairman of the SFOPS committee, and myself, as the ranking member of the SFOPS committee, had a very constructive conversation about how to better align the State Department's objectives with USAID's objectives. And by the way, this has been a bipartisan complaint over many, many administrations, that they are not sufficiently aligned. And that we're not targeting economic assistance, foreign military financing, and humanitarian aid as precisely as we ought to, and maybe even that some of the NGOs and for-profits that deliver the aid ought to be held accountable, just like in the Defense Department, just like any other department, for reducing their overhead costs. I said, I'm in. 2 days later, they don't fire everybody. They send 94% of employees home. Secretary Rubio reassures us multiple times, most of us on this committee on a bipartisan basis, don't worry, there's a waiver process. There is a waiver process. The problem is the building is shut down and nobody has access to their emails. You cannot process a waiver for life-saving humanitarian aid with no personnel. And so if there is an effort to reform USAID, to tighten up what it is that we do, to make sure that, and everybody, by the way, since I got on this committee and before, everybody talks about how smart China is for having Belt and Road, for making friends across the planet, and how cheap it is to do this kind of diplomacy compared to the Department of Defense. And we admire that, and we ponder it, and we say, we should do our own version of that. That's USAID. It's also parts of the State Department. And so I am all in for a 90-day review. But I just want everybody to understand what is happening now. A, what is happening is illegal. It is violating the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998. It is violating the Impoundment Control Act, and it is violating annual appropriations bills. So first of all, it's illegal. Second of all, according to USAID's own internal memos, this closure will result in up to 18 million additional cases of malaria per year because of the United States' illegal decision to shutter this agency. I can't believe that this has taken on some sort of partisan vibe. Does the United States of America, under any president, support 18 million additional cases of malaria? Is that who we've become? Is that America first? We're going to disagree about a lot in the foreign policy space. But we should not disagree about abiding by the law. We should not disagree that babies, when we can prevent it, should not get HIV/AIDS from their moms. And we should not disagree about a basic premise of foreign policy and the exercise of American might, which is sometimes the smartest thing for us to do is to show up with help. We have been doing this on a bipartisan basis, and we have to get back to that. This idea of a waiver process is fine, except it's not working. This idea of a 90-day review is fine, except in the meantime, we've eviscerated the program. And so I understand none of you are in the government, but I am just hoping, I am praying, I am begging that we can get back to a bipartisan consensus that we don't cut off our nose to spite our face, and we are the good guys. We do not cause death on purpose.
Senator Hagerty.
Thank you, Chairman Ricketts and Ranking Member Shaheen. I appreciate you holding this meeting for us. And I want to congratulate all of my friends here. All three of us served together in the last Trump administration. And I so admire the work that you did then, and I'm really looking forward to the work that you're going to do as we come into the next iteration of the administration. I'd like to start, Ambassador Landau, with you on a topic that's very specific. You understand it. Your background as our ambassador to Mexico. You get it. It's something that is deeply concerning to me. I think a number of my colleagues are aware of this, but perhaps a number aren't. And that is what's happening with the Mexican government and their unfair extra-legal campaigns to go in and confiscate the properties of U.S. companies. And you and I have talked specifically about the expropriation of Vulcan Materials, their quarries, their deepwater port, their properties in Mexico. Those aggregates that they mine there in the Gulf of Mexico are deeply critical to the infrastructure that we actually put in place in places like Florida, Louisiana, because there's not an aggregate source. The seam runs out, so to speak, before you get there. What the Mexican government has done is come in and taken this property from Vulcan Materials, an Alabama company, an American company. And they have a mine in Quintana Roo. They've got this deepwater port on the Yucatan Peninsula. And my fear is that that deepwater port is going to be for sale to the highest bidder if the Mexican government gets its hand on it. And I can tell you who that highest bidder will be. It'll be the CCP. Think about having a deepwater port that close, that proximate to the United States of America. I brought this seizure to the attention of the Biden administration. They did nothing to stop it. In fact, in the waning hours of the Biden administration, Ambassador Catherine Tai, the U.S. trade rep at the time, actually tried to go in and create some changes to the USMCA in a way that would quote, allow them to basically gut the claim that Vulcan Materials has and put Mexico on path to expropriate American properties throughout the nation. Senator Kaine and I subsequently led an effort to try to stop this plan to harm U.S. companies, and we eventually were able to get this taken care of. But it was a shocking to me that we as a nation, and certainly as a State Department, were willing to stand by and watch another nation expropriate the property of an American company. And Vulcan isn't the only one. That's just the one you and I have talked about more deeply. So, Ambassador Landau, could I get your perspective on how U.S. companies abroad who are facing this type of illegitimate activity, whether it be in Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, how will you expect us to approach this?
Absolutely, Senator, and thank you for that question, and thanks to you for your distinguished service as ambassador to Japan and what you have done in your present role as a senator to try to make the State Department a better place. I know you've sponsored very important legislation that I hope we have a chance to work with. Going to your specific question, when I served as ambassador, my number one job was to protect American interests in Mexico, where I was serving as ambassador. And so, if an American company is being threatened or harassed by the local government, it seems to me all our ambassadors have to understand that that is not a favor they are doing the company by standing up for their interests. That is their job as the representatives of our country. We want to support Americans, whether they be businesses or individuals. I am, as you are, extremely concerned about the actions of the Mexican government with respect to the Vulcan materials plant and the aggregate. I am familiar with that situation. I can certainly commit to you that on day one, if I am confirmed, I will call the Mexican government to address that problem and express our very strong concerns about what has happened to that American investment in Mexico. And I can also say that I would hope that if our friends in Mexico are watching this hearing, they will understand that it is not in their interest, if they are looking to renew their free trade agreement with the United States, to have a United States senator asking a nominee for Deputy Secretary of State about this terrible problem. The headline should be about great investment opportunities in all of our countries in North America. So it makes me sad for a lot of the Mexicans who I know are trying to increase trade, that we wind up stuck on this issue, and I very much hope the Mexican government will be able to resolve that problem even before I take office, if in fact I am confirmed. More broadly,
there's one more point I want to cover with you before I run out of time. You were an exceptional ambassador to Mexico, and you're going to be in a position to deploy our ambassadors who are vested with the full power of independent action. They're plenipotentiary. So I just want to get your thoughts on how you see the deployment of America's ambassadors around the world, how you will empower them to act on our nation's behalf. How do you see the ambassadorial role?
I think the ambassadorial role is so important, Senator. I think one of the reasons I was very honored to be asked by the President to become Deputy Secretary of State is that I have been an ambassador recently, and I think we need to have someone in the State Department who understands at the highest levels, working closely with the Secretary and the President, what an ambassador does and how to increase and strengthen that feedback loop between our Washington policymakers and our embassies, which I'm afraid is somewhat broken in both directions. I plan to meet, if I'm confirmed, with every outgoing ambassador to go over what are your top 3 priorities. I need specific action items and results, and then have accountability for our ambassadors so that when they go to their foreign posts, they can make it clear to their teams, this is what Washington is expecting of us, and we need to actually produce results to make sure that our embassies are providing us with useful, actionable information. I think that feedback loop really has deteriorated, and I look forward to working closely with you. I know, given your experience as ambassador to Japan, you have thoughts on this, and I think there's a lot more we can do to improve the performance of our embassies and make it more relevant to policymaking.
There certainly is, and you'll find bipartisan support for this on this committee. I'm sorry my time has run out, and I'm sorry to get a chance to speak with our other 2 distinguished nominees here, but I wish you all 3 the best, and I encourage my colleagues to get these folks on the ground and confirm quickly. Thank you.
Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Chair Risch and Ranking Member Shaheen for holding this hearing today. And before I begin my questions, I'd like to take a moment to discuss the State Department's reckless decision to effectively gut USAID and end foreign assistance. This will not only undermine our national security, harm our global standing, and lead to the deaths of innocent people around the world, but this negligence will also have an impact on my state of Nevada, which has benefited from nearly $40 million in USAID investments for global projects. I've also heard from constituents who have lost their jobs at USAID or soon expect to. So to my constituents, and to the USAID staffers out there, let me say this. We are grateful. I am grateful for your work. Did not deserve this, and we will not forget what has happened. On a different matter, having met with President Zelensky on Friday morning before the humiliating disaster in the Oval Office, I must also share my extreme frustration and immense embarrassment at President Trump and Vice President Vance's comments. Moreover, Last night's decision to suspend military assistance to Ukraine is a betrayal of the highest magnitude. Putin's war against Ukraine is a threat to all democracies around this planet. You all know this to be true. This is why the U.S. must continue our support. I know many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle agree. I urge them all to speak out. Today I want to speak a little bit more about women, peace, and security, because thanks to Ranking Member Shaheen's leadership, the Women, Peace, and Security WPS Act was signed by President Trump in 2017. It requires the administration to promote the meaningful participation of women in all aspects of conflict prevention and resolution. WPS programs are not DEI. They are an effective way of increasing the odds of reaching and keeping peace in conflict settings. And so we know that when women are in the room, the outcomes are better because of it. So, Mr. Landau, it's my understanding that many, if not all, WPS programs have been terminated or been paused. Been an ambassador? So I must ask you, do you believe it benefits U.S. national security to end these types of programs? Do you believe that these actions run contrary to the legal mandate of the WPS of 2017 and that they are going to hurt us? This is the law. And so I'm going to ask you to be brief. I can take your full comments off the record because I have a few other questions. Do you think this is hurting us?
Senator, I make 2 quick points. First, I think that my experience in life has always been that women add a very valuable perspective, and particularly on national security issues, and I'm pleased to see how many women are in the State Department. It is a massive change since my father's days 40 years ago, and I think that is a change for the good. With respect to your question about the law, obviously, you know, if I am confirmed, I will take an oath to support the Constitution and laws of the United States, and that is exactly what I intend to do.
Thank you. Mr. Whitaker, I'm going to turn quickly to you because last summer the United States and NATO allies committed to an updated WPS policy, recognizing the importance of women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in national security decision-making. As a permanent representative to NATO, will you commit to upholding the WPS agenda and ensure full implementation of the WPS law?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. I appreciate our time together to talk about this, and this came up in our meeting, as you recall. The practical effect at NATO is for example, designing military equipment for the combatants, for the Ukrainians in that are fighting this war, including many females, because of the manpower challenges that Ukraine has had. So certainly NATO has taken this in a practical and implemented it in that regard, and I will continue to work on that goal.
Thank you. I'm going to move quickly on to democracy programming in Iran because the Iranian regime terrorizes the people of Iran. Its terrorist processes attack and destabilize countries throughout the region, and we know throughout the world. It's why the U.S. has long supported programs in Iran that help Iranian people uncover corruption, expose terrorism, document human rights atrocities, and achieve internet freedom. These programs are now paused or terminated. It's a surprising move, but unsurprisingly, it's applauded by Iranian state media. So, Mr. Landau, do you think it makes our nation stronger, safer, and more prosperous for the U.S. to abandon Iranians working to expose Iranian's regime of corruption and support for terrorism? Is doing this, is it in our best interest?
Senator, I'd like to thank you for your leadership, particularly in that part of the world. I know on Israel and Iran issues, you've been a very strong and consistent voice. And with respect to that particular funding, I'm not familiar with those particular programs. If I am confirmed, I will certainly look into those programs, and I'd like to continue to discuss those with you, again, if I'm confirmed.
Well, I would, my last moment before we turn it over, I would say, I appreciate your commitment, but anything that the Iranian regime is applauding, that because we're stopped doing something, it's probably a good reason to restore it. Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we only get 5 minutes, and we have a lot to cover, so I am going to ask if you could keep your responses short. Elon Musk called AID a, quote, criminal enterprise, and he said we should put it through the wood chipper. Mr. Landau, do you agree with Elon Musk?
Senator, I agree with the president who insisted or created a 90-day waiver.
This is a simple question. Mr. Landau, I am asking you whether or not you agree with Elon Musk, who called AID a criminal enterprise and said we should put it through the wood chipper. Yes or no? This is a pretty simple question.
Senator, I think USAID provides some valuable services to our country, as it has. We have to separate.
Mr. Landau, do you know that the first claim that Elon Musk made about AID programs was a big lie? Did you see his claim that AID spent $50 million, the U.S. government spent $50 million on condoms in Gaza? Did you see that claim?
So, I'm not familiar with that particular.
That was the first, the new press person at the White House, that was the first piece of evidence she put out there about misspending the U.S. government. That was a lie, wasn't it?
Senator, I respect your focus.
Mr. Landau, I'm asking, this is my time to ask questions. If you don't want to answer them, you don't have to. But let me ask you this pretty straightforward question. Do you think that Putin and Russia were the aggressors in Ukraine?
Senator, at this point, there are peace negotiations taking place across the world.
Okay,
obviously,
Mr. Landau, this is a yes or no. Were they the aggressor or were they not the aggressor?
Senator, Ukraine invaded.
Mr. Landau, let me try with
Russia invaded Ukraine.
Mr. Whitaker is going to be, if confirmed, our ambassador to NATO. Mr. Whitaker, was Russia and Putin, were they the aggressors in the war on Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator. A couple quick thoughts on this. First of all, today I'm not here to assign labels, but I would say that J.D. Vance on Friday said that Russia invaded Ukraine.
Okay, so you don't know if they're the aggressor because were you surprised, for example, that the United States sided with North Korea and Russia against Ukraine and our NATO allies at the UN? And were you surprised at all?
Yeah, Senator, I think everything needs to be put in the context as Ambassador Landau was trying to. Okay. It is all a part of the negotiation for peace.
Okay, well, I think it's pretty clear to anybody with eyes to see that Russia and Putin were the aggressors in Ukraine. And it's very troubling that we can't get a straight yes or no answer here. Mr. Regas, I heard your testimony. We all agree that we should get rid of any waste, fraud, and abuse. I would submit that if you're interested in getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse in the U.S. government, you don't start by firing all the inspector generals whose job it is to be on the lookout for waste, fraud, and abuse. But we agree that we want people who can perform well in their jobs, right? Okay, I'm glad we can agree on that. And you would agree that it would be wrong to terminate somebody claiming that they were a poor performer when they were not. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Are you aware of the fact that many of these probationary employees that are being fired, the notices they're getting claim poor performance, but in fact, they've had very glowing recent performance reviews. Are you aware of that fact?
I've read accounts of that in the media, sir.
Right. So but you would agree that it's a bad idea to claim someone's a poor performer when they're not?
I think so, yeah.
So let me ask you about Schedule F. You're familiar with Schedule F?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm worried about Schedule F being implemented at the State Department because, as you know, we currently have a system where, presidents, of course, are entitled to lots of, political positions. There are hundreds of them. But we also have a merit-based civil service system. And my question to you is this. Do you agree that it would be a bad idea to take positions at the State Department that are currently merit-based, where people get hired based on their experience and their knowledge, and convert those into political positions? Do you agree that that would be a bad idea?
So thank you for the question, Senator. Are you referring to the new executive order the president signed, which was the policy schedule for career officials?
And I'm talking about whether you agree it would be a bad idea to take merit-based positions at the State Department and convert them into political positions.
Well, I think that the distinction between career and non-career officials, I think, is important. Non-career officials obviously have a lot more accountability because they are totally at will, and if they are not performing,
so you're, just to make sure I understand, you're saying we should convert more people to political because that would make them at will and more easily fired regardless of their merits?
No, what I'm saying is that leadership should have some flexibility in terms of there's a limited number of positions in the senior executive service that can be political, only 10% government-wide, and the law allows the leadership to determine which 10% of their department and agency will be. So it's possible that a general SES position, a position might be general in one administration and non-career in another.
Do you agree it would be a bad idea to convert 50 to 60,000 merit-based positions in the U.S. government, including some of the State Department, from merit-based to political?
Well, so I'm not aware of any proposal to convert 50 or 60,000 positions to non-merit-based positions.
Well, okay, that is Russ Vogt's plan, so we should have a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, if I can say, the new executive order which was signed provides for competitive hiring for those positions. The Schedule F executive order, which was signed in 2020, had non-competitive hiring. So that the new iteration of that has changed how the hiring occurs.
Right, but anyway, we can have a follow-up. Yeah. I hope our colleagues will agree that, of course, presidents are entitled to lots of political positions. Yes. I mean, all of you are nominated. I understand that. But we have had a tradition, and the Pendleton Act has established the idea of a merit-based civil service and merit-based foreign service. That law was extended. And so, you know, I hope, Mr. Chairman, Senator Ricketts, that we will all agree that we should not begin converting merit-based civil service positions or merit-based foreign service positions based on knowledge and qualifications into political sort of payoffs. But I appreciate the time, and thank you.
Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Landau, is President Trump a Russian asset?
Absolutely not, Senator. He's the President of the United States, duly elected by the American people.
Well, the reason I ask is many people back home have been asking me this question. And they say, if he was an asset, we would see exactly what he's doing now. For example, he proceeded to forward or express from the Oval Office propaganda that has been Russian propaganda, that Ukraine started the war, that Zelensky is a dictator. Second of all, he gave away key things on the negotiating table before the negotiations even started, ensuring U.S. would absolutely oppose any possibility of NATO membership for Ukraine. Third, he's cut off the arms shipments to Ukraine, completely undermining their ability against a massive neighbor next door with short supply lines and huge resources. Fourth, he's undermined the partnership with Europe, which has been essential to security over the last 80 years, a major goal of Putin's. And then he's done everything to discredit and dismean Zelensky on the international stage with the just shameful press conference in which he teamed up with the vice president to attack Zelensky. I can't imagine that if he was a Russian asset, he could do anything more favorable than these 5 points. What else could a Russian asset actually possibly do that Trump hasn't yet done?
Senator, the president has made it absolutely clear that his top priority is to try to bring peace and end an absolutely savage war. I know you're familiar with the savagery. This is turning into World War I-style trench warfare now in eastern Ukraine. The president is an exceptionally gifted deal maker. He is probably the only individual in the entire universe that could actually stop this. The president understands, as part of his deal making.
Well, let's turn to another of the folks here.
Carrots and sticks.
Thank you very much, since you're now off the topic I was raising. Mr. Whitaker, these 5 things that the president has done that are so favorable to Putin and so damaging to Ukraine and to our partnership with Europe, do you approve of them?
Well, Senator, thanks for that question. I'm just going to have to politely disagree with you on those 5 things and the way you've framed them. You know, the war in Ukraine would have never happened if President Trump was president in 2022. The war in Ukraine happened because of Joe Biden's weakness after his
I don't think
withdrawal
that
from
was the question I
Afghanistan.
asked, but maybe you could some other time go on television and express those points of view. But do you mind just answering the question I asked? Do you agree with the 5 things that President Trump has done, starting with him expressing Russian propaganda from the Oval Office?
Well, you know, again, as I mentioned to your colleague, I am not here to assign labels. We're in the middle of a very important peace negotiation.
Okay,
I agree
thank
with Ambassador.
you. I do hope that we have an administration that works to get the very best deal for Ukraine, but what a Russian asset would do would be to work to get the very best deal for Russia, and that appears to be exactly what Donald Trump is trying to accomplish. I want to turn to USAID, and you've heard from my colleagues. We have a group, Mercy Corps, headquartered out of Oregon, that has contracts all over the world, places like Liberia and Kenya and Syria and DRC and Ethiopia. One of the things that I was really struck by was one of their contracts. These are mostly clean water, health care, nutrition contracts, helping people in desperate situations in partnership with the host nations, which is all about both helping people but also building that relationship with those nations. But in Liberia, the contract that was canceled provides support for school lunches for 146 schools and 25,000 children. I was very struck by this particular contract because when I was down in Guatemala, I was asking the president, what is the most effective program we have in Guatemala that he'd like to see expanded? This is a former president of Guatemala. And he said, school lunch program. He said, here's the reason why. 1, our kids don't have enough nutrition. They're stunted. Second of all, the prospect of getting lunches at school gets them to school, and education is essential. He said, third of all, it creates local contracts for people who prepare the lunches, so it's a little bit of economic investment in every village around the country. Does it make any sense to cancel a program like that that is so beneficial in so many different ways and is done in partnership with the host nation?
Is that directed at me, Senator?
Sure.
Well,
why not?
As you know, NATO is a different animal.
Absolutely, I know it is, but you have broad foreign policy experience, so maybe you'd like to, and maybe I'll just get quickly an answer from all 3 of you, whether it makes sense to cancel such a program.
So if I could hop in a second, the Secretary Rubio's waiver specifically covers life-saving medicine, medical services, food, shelter, and subsistence.
Very interesting. Then why hasn't this contract been restored?
Again, sir, I can just look at the waiver. If confirmed,
well, here's the thing. Let me just explain that the Solicitor General, Sarah Harris, said the funding freeze is not continuing. It is over. But the fact is the gears are not turning, and the gears have to turn in order for contracts to be restored and for aid to flow. And so we're talking about diseases overseas. We don't want people getting on planes with those diseases and bringing those, well, the fancy term, but Ebola-type style of diseases here to the United States, et cetera. And it is just double talk to say that the funding freeze is over when the gears aren't turning because administrations find other ways to keep them from turning, including having fired all the people who turned the gears. So I don't want to hear about the waivers when there's no sincerity in actually applying them and making the AID function again. My time's up. Thanks.
Thank you. Senator Scott.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Senator Lee was here first, actually. I didn't see you come back in, Senator Lee.
Thank you.
Senator Lee, go ahead, and then we'll go to...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here and for your willingness to serve. Mr. Landau, I'd like to start with you, if that's all right. You've spoken today about the need to restore statecraft, economic statecraft, as a core function of the U.S. State Department. You've also acknowledged this administration has been clear-eyed about the need to rethink and revisit certain aspects of foreign aid and how it works. But getting back to economic statecraft, would you agree that the tools available to the United States in the economic statecraft domain, including things like trade agreements and other efforts that involve reducing trade barriers, arguably have a better return on investment for us than foreign aid in the traditional sense, and should perhaps be our primary line of effort?
Senator Lee, I appreciate that question. I think that is such an important point to underscore, that there's probably no force in the world that is as powerful as the American private sector. And if we are looking to increase prosperity abroad, I think we'll get a much higher rate of return from helping private sector money find its way to places where the private sector knows how best to spend it and how best to get returns. Not to say there's not a role for USAID, but I think looking at this, for maybe for too long, for decades, we've looked at this as American taxpayers sending aid dollars abroad. I would love to focus on how do we get the American private sector to improve the standard of living of countries abroad by investing, by increasing flows of capital to some of those other countries so they can build economy. Again, we saw that in China. There's no more powerful force than free market systems when those are operating. So again, I think your insight is a very important one. That's not to say there's not a role for certain government programs, and that's fine. But in terms of State Department resources, I think we have severely underinvested in the kind of programs you're talking about.
People want to trade with the United States, and they benefit meaningfully from it. Their people benefit meaningfully from it. And so insofar as we can use that, that can really go a long way. It can make a really big difference. Mr. Whitaker, I'd like to go to you next. It is, in my view, in the view of many, including within the current administration, far past time for our NATO allies to take their own defense, their own security needs seriously. And the President, of course, has called for our allies to spend 5% of GDP on defense. Now, defense spending is at least in part driven by threat perceptions, by what people perceive as necessary in order to keep themselves safe. And the perception of a threat risk may vary a little bit between the East Bloc and the West Bloc, sort of within NATO, and it varies also depending on which side of the Atlantic Ocean you might be on. Defense spending is also a decision that is, of course, necessarily subject to domestic processes, to domestic scrutiny, to engagement, normally with the elected representatives, people who are elected to make law in their respective countries. In light of all these factors, how achievable, how reconcilable, how gettable is this sort of return to a proper burden shifting in light of all the challenges that we face there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Senator. I enjoyed our time yesterday to talk about this. For a few minutes, it seemed like a couple of lawyers nerding out on the law, but I did enjoy the discussion.
It was kind of like that, I guess, wasn't it? Yeah.
But that being said, you're right. Defense spending is subject to domestic political concerns, and for too long, our European allies and Canada, many of them, have balanced their budgets of their domestic political concerns on the backs of the American taxpayer, who has taken our place in the world as the only superpower very seriously and has invested in our defense. Obviously, if confirmed, when I get over there, I look forward to the conversation with all of the members on this committee about whether or not our NATO allies are really committed to the alliance. They say they are. They say, but again, are these politicians just providing empty promises, or are they actually stepping up, understanding that the world is dangerous and the U.S. is their best ally in a dangerous world?
Right. And that the U.S. is their best ally, albeit an ally that they're ready to cast aside the minute they decide to hold side meetings that don't include us when they're upset with us. But regardless, we have been bearing a disproportionate share of their security umbrella for a very long time. It's been good for them insofar as their objective has been an inexorable march toward Western European-style socialism, but that doesn't necessarily make it fair to the United States of America or her taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. And Mr. Whitaker, let me say that if you're going to have a conversation to nerd out on the law, you couldn't find a better or more willing partner than Senator Lee. He is outstanding in that regard.
I agree with you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kane.
Thank you. Simple question for each of you. who instigated the current war in Gaza?
I would say Hamas did by...
Mr. Regas?
I would agree with my colleague.
Mr. Whitaker?
Yeah, October 7th was an invasion by Hamas.
So you didn't have any problem saying who instigated the war in Gaza, but none of you would be candid about who instigated the war in Ukraine. And what you said is the reason, and I'm going to be fair to Mr. Regas, I didn't hear you be equivocal about that. I heard Mr. Whitaker and Mr. Landau. What you said is there's sensitive and delicate negotiations going on right now, and I'm not here to label. There's a sensitive and delicate negotiation going on between Israel, Gaza, and other parties right now about extending a ceasefire, and it's really important to Israel, and it's really important to hostage families, and it's really important to Palestinians. It's really important in the Red Sea because the Houthis have stopped firing into the Red Sea during the ceasefire, and if we extend it, we have reason to believe that the Houthis will continue to not fire at U.S. ships. So I'm noticing this. Senator Shaheen and I were just at a hearing with the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Mr. Bridge Colby, and he said the same thing. He was asked who was responsible for the war in Ukraine, who instigated it. Well, there's a sensitive, delicate negotiation. I don't really want to opine about who instigated it. So I asked him who instigated the war in Gaza, and he said it was Hamas. We got to be willing to tell the truth. And I know answering the question truthfully might make a superior uncomfortable, but Americans deserve the truth. And if we're voting to confirm people for really critical positions, and you've all served in important positions, and you're all nominated for really important positions, we've got to have a sense that you're going to be truthful. And that the truthful nature of your comments may or may not be listened to, your advice may or may not be followed, but what you owe to your commander-in-chief, what you owe to the country, what you owe to the oath you take, is to be truthful. And I just can't help but notice it was so easy to answer the question about who instigated the war in Gaza, and so difficult for just folks to be plain and answer the question about who instigated the war in Ukraine. Mr. Regas, I have a question for you about Schedule F, and my colleague, Senator Van Hollen, has already mentioned it. And Schedule F was the first Trump term proposal. It's now Schedule PC, and you indicated there's some similarities, there's some differences. You were part of both OPM and the OMB during the first Trump term, and the guidance in that agency suggested there was a desire to reclassify 80% of employees in those agencies from traditional political service to Schedule F. Do you have a sense of what the likely percentage reclassification would be at the Department of State under Trump administration term 2?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And again, I enjoyed our meeting. I think you were the first senator I met with in this process, so I got off to a great start there. I don't know that I can put a number on that. I can tell you how I went about the process at OPM. At the time, I was actually the acting director of the Office of Personnel Management.
Please do.
So I had to implement the President's executive order on Schedule F. And what we did is we asked our career chief human capital officer and our HR folks to look at the position descriptions to see which positions were policy making, policy influencing, confidential, or policy advocating positions.
And was that with a goal to getting to this 80% will be Schedule F?
No, that was my understanding. The 80% number, I'm not sure where that comes from, but I know, I think you may be referring to what happened at OMB, where OMB Director Vogt at the time did a similar analysis and came up with that number.
Was there a target number at OPM?
There was not. We just asked them to look at the position descriptions and let those speak for themselves.
How does Schedule PC differ from Schedule F?
Schedule PC, to my understanding, I think the major difference is that it provides for a competitive hiring process.
But folks can still be fired and not really have recourse to challenge a termination.
Yes, they would.
Yeah, and that's pretty important. Right now, I'll just say this and conclude. We see the administration firing probationary employees because probationary employees don't have the same access to challenge it.
Right.
What that means is it's a war on veterans because probationary employees are either brand new people, like right out of college, or career switchers. 30% of the federal workforce is veterans. They're career switchers. They tend to come in after serving 15 or 20 years, and they're probationary, even though they may be 45 or 50 years old. And that's why President Trump, in his first 6 weeks in office, has fired more veterans than any president in the history of the United States. And I think that's a disgrace, not a distinction. But I appreciate you sharing the difference between Schedule F and what Schedule PC is, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. There's nothing to yield back, but I will accept it in any event. Thank you. Senator Scott.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. First off, congratulations on your nominations. You guys have had distinguished careers, and I know you're going to do a great job. It's fun to listen to everybody's ideas about foreign policy. So first, let me just start with Mr. Whitaker. How do you see your role helping the President get our European allies to do their job? Not only for their own security, but to carry their full weight as NATO members. It doesn't seem to me that they must be too worried about their defense right now or what's going to happen, but how are you going to get them to do what they should be doing?
Well, thank you, Senator Scott, and it's good to see you again. First, obviously, being there day to day in Brussels at NATO headquarters, interacting with our 31 other NATO allies, I think is the most important thing. To have somebody like myself, that has been with President Trump since the last administration, I think is going to send a very clear message from the President that it is time to step up and not just pay lip service to it. I think it also is important to drive the issues that I mentioned earlier: interoperability, a modernization of our warfighting effort at NATO with our allies, and at the same time addressing the hybrid threats that we're seeing in space and cyber and in the seas with cable cutting and the like. So I think there's a lot of things, but the primary thing is if confirmed, getting there and impressing upon our allies how serious this moment in world history is.
When I first came up here in 2019, I went to the Munich Security Conference and met with the German delegation, and they basically told us to go jump in the lake. They weren't going to increase their funding, and so how are you going to change that attitude? What's going to change? I mean, why? Let me put it in. Why would they change? I mean, we've been sitting here, been their umbrella forever. What's going to make them change?
Well, President Trump's going to make them change, and I think you've already seen the dramatic increase in commitments from our NATO allies, and his saying things like NATO is a good thing if done properly and used properly, and saying that Europeans need to step up. I think President Trump communicates directly, and he has been very clear to our allies. And if anybody is below what they committed to 10 years ago of 2%. In June, during the first Trump summit with our NATO allies, that's going to be a very bad scene. But if there's not a commitment and a plan to get to 5% as soon as possible, I think again, our NATO allies should be very concerned.
Since Russia invaded Ukraine, the Baltics and Poland and a few others have acted with speed and commitment to help themselves and help Ukraine. Have we reached a point where we now are more aligned with, Poland and the Baltic states than we are with all the other NATO nations?
Well, Senator, obviously, if you're on the border with Russia and you're seeing, how Vladimir Putin has conducted his foreign policy, you have a real view of the world, and they have Poland and our Baltic allies have been really extraordinary in addressing what is their threats. Because remember, Article 3, everybody wants to talk about Article 5, Senator, but Article 3 says that each NATO ally commits to both the collective defense but individual defense. And I think that is often ignored in the broader discussion, but that's so important to what's happening with those on the front line, and at the same time, they should be applauded for that commitment to increasing their defense spending and recognizing the real threat, because Russia is the largest geopolitical threat to Europe. It is not the largest geopolitical threat to the United States of America. And because we've talked about it earlier, China is that geopolitical threat, and the United States needs to address that, and it needs to balance all of those concerns.
Mr. Rigas and Landau, can you talk about a little bit about how you envision the realignment of the Secretary of State's office as you work with Secretary of State Rubio? What do you guys think you ought to be doing to make us more focused?
Sure. Thank you for that question.
We talked about that a little bit yesterday.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question, Senator. As I said in my opening statement, I think part of what I'm going to be responsible for and what I'd like to do is make sure we have the right people with the right skills, doing the right things, and in the right places. And I'd like to roll up my sleeves and ask questions about where people are and what they're doing. I was talking to a senior Foreign Service officer who was in Africa and said, I've got one economic affairs slot here, and I've struggled to fill, and Paris has 5. And I don't know if that's the right mix or the right allocation of where folks ought to be, but I like to ask questions and come up with a good plan for that.
Ambassador Landau, you would add anything?
Senator, again, I think we need to really increase our focus on economic diplomacy around the world. And just finally, I could like to thank you for your leadership on hemispheric issues. And if I'm confirmed, I really look forward to working closely with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for that comment on Section 3. Everybody focuses on Section 5, but Section 3 is really, really important. The good news is, in my discussions with the European allies, most, if not all, have come to or are coming to the realization that the biggest threat is not Russia. It is obviously an immediate problem. But for the rest of this century, the challenge, our challenge, the Europeans' challenge, is going to come from China, clearly. With that, Senator Shaheen, did you have a...
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to echo what you just said about China, but I would point out that one of the things that China is watching very closely is what we do in Ukraine. And if we walk away from our allies in our ally Ukraine, it's going to say a lot to President Xi about what we might do in terms of supporting or not supporting Taiwan if he invades. So I would just urge you all to consider that as you're looking at the calculus about how we need to address China. Mr. Whitaker, you alluded to this a little bit, but I just want to be clear. Under your leadership in Brussels, if confirmed, will the United States' commitment to NATO be ironclad, including our commitment to Article 5?
Thank you, Senator, and we talked about this when we had a chance to visit last week. It will be ironclad. Article 5, I think, binds all of the allies, but at the same time, as President Trump has been, and he just spoke on this earlier this week, he says, I support it, but we shouldn't have to use it. And I think that's very important.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have limited time. So do you support the continued presence of U.S. troops on NATO's eastern flank, including in Poland, where the U.S. leads the multinational battle group, and also in the Baltic states?
Yeah, as we discussed, Senator, I think obviously those forward deployed Eastern European U.S. assets, together with our allies, are very important to this strategic posture of both the United States of America and, most importantly, NATO.
Thank you. You talked about wanting to commit the United States to 5% of GDP for our defense spending. Do you know what we spend now in terms of GDP?
Senator, I've seen a lot of estimates, but the best I can tell is we spend about $850 billion on the United States defense, which is about 3.5% of our GDP.
Actually, in 2024, we spent $886 billion, which is 3.4% of GDP, a little over that. Do you know what it would take to get us to 5%?
Well, in Iowa, we would say a whole lot more money.
A whole lot more money. So 5% of our GDP last year would be 1.5 trillion. So it would take another 550 billion. So as we're talking about how do we get to an increased level of spending, we also need to have a plan for how the United States would get there. Mr. Regas, I want to go back to something we discussed in my office. And I raised concern about some of your writings with respect to how you referenced federal employees. So if you could just clarify for me in this hearing, do you believe that career federal employees, patriotic Americans like Mr. Landau's father, who served as a career Foreign Service officer across both Republican and Democratic administrations, do you believe those career federal employees are able to carry out the president's lawful policies?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and thank you again for taking the time to meet with me. Yes, and I've said, there were a number of writings I submitted as part of my questionnaire, including this chapter that I co-authored on America First national security policy. And right on page 1, I say there, we believe that most civil servants show up to work every day and do their jobs dutifully on behalf of the President and the American people. Many career officials have tremendous institutional knowledge and expertise and are a great resource to our government, and they serve our fellow citizens well.
I appreciate your clarifying that, because that's been my experience as well. And I think it's unfortunate to make such blanket statements about career employees being members of the swamp and not being willing to carry out the president's policies, no matter who the president is. So, Mr. President, or Mr. Chairman, for the record, I would like to introduce these two pieces of writings from Mr. Regas for the record. One is a September 2023 op-ed, and the other is the chapter of a book co-authored by Mr. Regas, chapter 12.
They will be included in the record. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Landau, the National Endowment for Democracy is an organization whose concept was conceived by President Reagan, but it's been starved for funds by this administration, despite a line item for its appropriation and a statutory mandate that NED, the acronym for the National Endowment for Democracy, receive a grant annually from the State Department. They have had to furlough 75% of their staff. They've halted all grant making. Now, this is a low overhead cost organization. It's, as I said, it's one that was created and conceived by President Reagan. It works exclusively to advance free elections, the free market, and democracy in places where our adversaries rule against their people and against America, countries like Iran and China and North Korea and Cuba. So if you're confirmed, will you ensure that the Department of State complies with the NED Act and appropriations law that make NED's funds urgently available?
Yes, Senator, I believe with all my soul and fiber, every fiber of my body, in the rule of law, that if a law is constitutional, that it's our job, if I'm confirmed to be part of the executive branch, to comply with that law. And so if, in fact, the statutory, there are mandatory statutory items, then, I will certainly, do my best to make sure, or my job will be to follow the law. That is what I do. If I'm part of the executive branch, you all make the laws, and it's our job, for those of us who might be in the executive branch, to execute the laws, assuming the law is constitutional. So I can give you that commitment.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Duckworth.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I echo the ranking member's call to bring Secretary Rubio before this committee. Every one of us should have the chance to go over the list of USAID programs with Secretary Rubio. I am extremely concerned about the upheaval and devastation being wrought by this administration's disastrous and systemic dismantling of foreign policy and foreign assistance apparatus. And I'm further concerned by the long-term impacts, not least of all to the lives and livelihoods of those around the world, but also the trust and commitments that this administration has broken that cannot be repaired so easily, even if the folks in charge did an about-face today. Last year, then DepSec of State Kurt Campbell met with this committee and emphasized the strategy of invest, align, compete in response to the PRC's growing geopolitical influence in the Indo-Pacific. Secretary Rubio highlighted his own vision of making us safer, stronger, and more prosperous, but he's currently failing at that mark as he cedes ground to the PRC. The PRC is undercutting our soft power, and is now pursuing an agenda that is opaque, illegal, if you ask me, and fails to uphold our commitment contracts throughout the process. The Trump administration is undercutting our soft power. Look at our farmers in the Midwest. I am especially concerned with the cuts to USAID. Over the last 4 fiscal years, USDA purchased food commodities to distribute via USAID from farmers in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Missouri, Florida. In Iowa, USAID accounted for $64 million in funds that were bought from Iowa farmers. In Indiana, $4 million. Nebraska, we bought $102 million worth of agricultural goods for USAID. In Missouri, it was $79 million. Florida, $99 million. Wisconsin, $230 million. These programs now are on hold, and our farmers are going to suffer as a result of ending the USAID programs. Mr. Regas, you worked at the firm that advises clients how to navigate federal contracting, and I'm hearing from organizations in Illinois and around the country that are still owed tens of millions of dollars in reimbursement for work done in December and January. They have not been paid. They don't know when they will receive the money they are owed, and we're getting to the point where they may be owed interest on their outstanding money as well. Some of these American-founded and run organizations are exploring bankruptcy as something they may have to consider. They've already laid off hundreds of staff, by the way, and that doesn't sound like prosperity to me. Some of them report that they have been told by USAID that reimbursements for work done in December and January will only be provided for expenses that this administration deems legitimate or that they would have approved, even though these were contracts from the last administration for work done during the last administration. Mr. Rodriguez, who was the president back in December through January of 20? January 20th?
Who was the president in December of
2024 through January 20 of 2025?
President Joe Biden.
Putting your contracting advisor hat back on, would you have advised anyone in December to anticipate that the government might not reimburse for work appropriately directed under that administration?
I think the federal contracting law is pretty clear. So if a contractor has provided goods or services, they're going to be paid. I don't see how that wouldn't happen.
Okay, but they haven't been paid yet for December or January. That's a problem for these companies that are now facing bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And it's going to cost taxpayers more money if we have to pay those contracts with interest.
Yeah.
If confirmed, you will be overseeing the Office of Foreign Assistance, where many of these illegal and unprecedented directives have originated. Can you commit to me that if you're confirmed, Mr. Rodriguez, you will swiftly move to correct this issue and at a bare minimum reimburse organizations for the work that they did before the stop work order?
Of course, Senator, if confirmed, absolutely. I would go in, make sure, see what kind of a disconnect has occurred or if there's been a miscommunication. But certainly to me, it would seem anyone that has a contract to provide goods and services to the United States government and has rendered those goods and services to the United States government should be paid for them and will be paid.
Good, that's good to hear. Thank you. I'm not even talking about what has happened under this funding freeze, which I also find egregious. I'm just talking about work that was done prior to that freeze. And so thank you for that commitment. Moving on to our strength, one area where I thought we might have continuity of purpose, and in our discussion we talked about UXO clearance. With this administration's stop work order and foreign assistance freeze, UXO clearance work funded by the U.S. and implemented by partners on the ground was stopped. In some countries like Vietnam, those war legacies issues are the bedrock of our relationship that we have cultivated over decades. In others, they are one of the few connective tissues we have. And you know what happened when we did the stop work? Immediately, PRC came in and gave a $4.4 million contract to take over the UXO work that we were funding, that we established on the ground. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record Radio Free Asia article talking about the PRC stepping in.
It will be included, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think it looks good. Do you think that looks good, to have the PRC stepping in on this work?
I'm not familiar with that particular case, but I think we've talked at this hearing about our need to compete and confront where China is gaining around the world at the expense of U.S. interests. So to the extent, it would certainly be a priority of mine. I know it's a priority of the President's to push back on the gains that China has made, certainly in the Western Hemisphere and everywhere else where U.S. interests are at stake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Landau, I want to focus on Iran's push to build nuclear weapons, which I believe presents one of the most immediate and acute threats to American national security. Under the first Trump administration, President Trump imposed maximum pressure, first by denying the Ayatollah oil revenue, then rescinding civil nuclear waivers, and ultimately by invoking UN snapback sanctions. The Biden administration dismantled that pressure, as the Iranian regime knew that they would, and so the regime began rushing to a nuclear weapon immediately after the November election. We know the result. Today, the Ayatollah has achieved a nuclear breakout time of nearly zero. We now face the very real possibility of an Iranian nuclear arsenal. I do not believe this is a threat the U.S. can tolerate, and I'm glad that the Trump administration is taking action. We've already seen the Trump administration restore parts of the maximum pressure campaign with the goal of cutting their oil exports completely to zero. Next, we have to cancel any civil nuclear waivers and reinvoke the UN snapback. I asked in written testimony to this committee whether Secretary Rubio intends to do so, and here was his response, quote, I believe it is our national security interest for the UN Security Council to snap back the sanctions that were suspended under the JCPOA. I will execute the President's guidance and work with our allies to ensure that snapback takes place. I also asked incoming Ambassador to the United Nations, Stefanik, about the issue, and she said she will work with the White House and Secretary Rubio to develop a strategy to do exactly that. Both said an Iranian nuclear weapon poses an acute national security threat to the United States. First, do you agree with their assessment that it is in the national security interest of the United States to snap back the UN sanctions?
Yes, Senator.
Talk about how you would work to support our UN mission, the State Department, and the administration, and in particular to invoke the UN snapback mechanism, either unilaterally or working with allies.
Senator, let me just take a step back and reiterate, I'm so glad that you bring up this really important issue of Iran's nuclear capabilities, because I think there are few more acute threats in the world today, and I think the President has made it clear on numerous occasions that he shares the view that you just articulated, that it is completely unacceptable to U.S. national security to have, for Iran to be a nuclear-armed power in this world. Certainly the State Department will do everything we can, as Senator Rubio and Representative Stefanik have indicated to you, to work with other countries around the world to make sure that they're not just U.S. sanctions on Iran, but that if an alliance means something, it's got to mean something that when we say something is an existential threat to the world, that our allies would agree with us and would act in conjunction. You can't just be allies for the things that the allies might care about. I mean, there are broader implications of things that we care about. And I think we should generally make it clear to our allies that if you want to be our allies, let's try to identify and work together on issues that we all care about in different parts of the world. And so Iran is certainly one of those.
Terrific. Mr. Whitaker, we've heard a lot of histrionics recently about President Trump's policies towards Europe and Ukraine. First, obviously and candidly, I've heard from colleagues on both sides of the aisle, the meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky was an inexplicable catastrophe. What we witnessed was an outburst that was completely out of line, delusional, and frankly, deeply disrespectful to the President of the United States. In my view, President Zelensky's behavior in that meeting will go down in history as the most disastrous Oval Office encounter ever. Zelensky's behavior was the exact opposite of what he should have been doing. The United States has provided Ukraine with hundreds of billions of dollars to support its fight against Russia, and yet his attitude was arrogant, and his actions didn't just harm Ukraine, they also harmed America. In fact, President Zelensky played right into Putin's hands by setting back efforts to end the war quickly. Any outcome that benefits Russia does not benefit America. The war must end, I believe, with a clear and unmistakable loss for Russia. After the war ends, the next question is going to be what Europe does with energy. And as you and I discussed, energy was a major cause of the war, with Joe Biden waiving sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which was the precipitating cause of the war. Two-part question. Number one, what is your understanding of why the war started? And number two, how should the issue of European energy security be handled? And should Europe get its energy from Russia or from America?
Yeah, well, thank you, Senator. I enjoyed our conversation. We've known each other for a long time, and it was good to not only catch up, but talk about these important issues that face our European allies and the NATO alliance that we're a part of. First, it's very clear to me that when Joe Biden removed those sanctions from Nord Stream 2, that gave the money that Vladimir Putin needed to execute this war. It took away the need for Russian gas to pass through Ukraine because they had a new route for that gas straight to Central Europe. At the same time, Joe Biden's weakness in the Afghanistan withdrawal, I think, also gave a green light to Vladimir Putin to commence the war in 2022. So I think those two factors, as we discussed, were critical to that war, and it would have never happened if Donald Trump was president in 2022. There is no doubt to me that one of the reasons for the NATO alliance, it is, again, as I mentioned earlier, the most successful alliance in the history of the world. But it also protects our allies, and our allies should protect us. And that includes not only military alliances, but trade alliances. And the fact that Europe continues to buy billions of dollars worth of gas from Russia instead of buying American liquid natural gas, I think is just a travesty. And hopefully we can increase that capacity to export here in the U.S. and for them to receive it in Europe so that dependence on Russia and the funding of Vladimir Putin's war machine can end.
Very much agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. For the record, your comments are well taken on Europe attempting to replace that, and there's a lot of efforts going on their part to do it. Frankly, a lot of us are amazed that they were able to do as much as they have in such short order, but they continue to work on it, so good for that. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to our three colleagues. I checked with my office, and you may have requested meetings with me. I apologize if my schedule didn't permit me to meet with you before this hearing. I would welcome a chance to meet after this, because I think the odds you will be confirmed are high, and you will play central roles in our State Department and in our engagement with our critical NATO partners in Europe. Mr. Landau, as I said before, or Ambassador Landau, forgive me, your decades of engagement with the Foreign Service, your previous service as an ambassador to Mexico, I think recommends you for this role. And if I heard you correctly in your opening testimony, you suggested that mass migration globally is one of the great challenges to stability, peace, security around the world. Help me understand, in your view, are programs that counter human trafficking, programs that help families sustain themselves with productive agriculture and help reduce the pressures for migration, are those programs beneficial?
I think as a general matter, Senator, yes, they can be beneficial. I think you'd have to look program by program. I don't think you can paint with too broad a brush. And I think certainly we have been putting a lot of money into countries like Honduras for as long as I can remember, my whole life, and I'm not sure that we've seen the kind of results you would expect. So I think theoretically, yes, and I think we should certainly explore, are there programs that we can promote that are actually effective programs to limit migration?
So, Ambassador, I'll tell you that in my view, having visited a number of programs that were sponsored through the U.S. State Department and through USAID that were designed to help young people resist predation by human traffickers, reduce their temptation to join gangs, help support rural agriculture in countries like Guatemala, Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, were largely effective in reducing the inclination to go hundreds, if not thousands of miles and present at our southern border. I think they're wise investments, and I think it's unwise that they've been abruptly cut off. I hope we can work together on finding ways to identify and restore funding to those programs that reduce mass migration and those programs that effectively counter China and Chinese and Russian disinformation. Are you familiar with IRI and NDI?
Yes, the
International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, launched by President Reagan for decades, deserving of bipartisan support, critical for sustaining, for example, a NATO ally, Romania, Moldova, not yet a member of either the EU or NATO, that are facing upcoming elections. The IRI and NDI for decades have helped counter disinformation by Russia and China and helped facilitate the movement towards being democracies by former Soviet states. Do you have any sense whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to completely shut down IRI and NDI?
Senator, I think it's something that we should certainly look very closely at, and if I am confirmed, I would be more than happy to work with you to talk about specific efforts there. Let's look at the funding streams, what they're doing, and again, I think I can certainly commit to working with you on that.
Well, I'd appreciate the opportunity. My experience over the last few weeks, and I served with Senator Rubio and voted for Secretary Rubio, has been that on the one hand, we're told there's a long review going on, there's waivers being given, but Senator Sullivan is the board chair of IRI, a Republican, Marine veteran, a big believer in IRI. They are laying people off. We don't have time for a long discussion. We need to act to restore funding and functionality to a wide range of long demonstrated bipartisan programs, from PEPFAR to counter trafficking, to counter migration, to programs that counter Russian and Chinese disinformation. Last, Mr. Regas, if I might, Is it your understanding that the workforce at state should brace for Doge-style cuts that will lead to thousands of members of the civil service being fired abruptly, without cause, and without warning?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I have no insight into any plans of that nature, and to the extent my understanding is, at least from reading media reports, is probationary employees that have been let go or put on leave. I believe that's already happened.
One of those probationary employees just joined my office, a talented and capable young person who left a great job in Rome to come back to the United States to take a job at the State Department working in international religious freedom, was abruptly fired without cause. And I'll say for a young generation of potential career Foreign Service and Civil Service officers, I think we are causing real harm. We've long benefited from new generations of folks joining the diplomatic service, the civil service, and I think we're making a huge mistake. I think we need to look carefully at the alignment of the State Department, at whether the funds are being spent wisely, the posts and missions make sense, but to do it in the same way that the chainsaw was just taken to USAID would be a tragic mistake. We should not be shutting down missions, laying off individuals by the thousands, and canceling programs all over the world. You should not let what just happened to AID happen to the State Department. I think it would be a critical strategic mistake. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Thank you to our panel. Strong showing today. You guys have done well. Look forward to moving the administration forward after we get you confirmed as soon as we possibly can. I'm going to add the letters of support for each of the members to this record. For the information of the members of the committee, the record will remain open until close of business tomorrow, Wednesday, March 5th, including for members to submit questions for the record. I'd ask you to answer those questions as rapidly as you can. With that, the hearing is adjourned.